A ruthless millionaire made his virgin secretary a proposal no contract had ever foreseen. She would have to give her body or lose everything she had fought to achieve. It wasn't love, it was domination, and she knew it. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you are listening from. Leonard Ashworth was the sort of man who never allowed himself to desire anything he couldn't purchase. A millionaire before 30, heir to a legal empire built upon buried scandals and deadly contracts, he embodied absolute control, tall, elegant, reserved to the point of resembling a grey marble statue. At 44, he carried a sealed past, where love had been a threat and affection a dangerous currency. He had never truly loved, and when he'd attempted it, he'd lost everything. Since then, only power moved him. Until she arrived. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ashworth & Associates' 32nd floor offices in the heart of London's financial district. October had arrived with its usual vengeance, turning the Thames into a churning mass of grey water that mirrored the leaden sky above. Leonard stood motionless behind his mahogany desk, a figure carved from shadow and expensive tailoring, watching the city blur through sheets of water. His reflection in the glass was ghost-like, translucent, as if he were already beginning to fade from the world. The Ashworth building rose like a monolith among the gleaming towers of Canary Wharf, its dark glass facade reflecting nothing and revealing less. 35 floors of legal machinations, where fortunes were made and destroyed with the stroke of a pen, where secrets were currency and silence was gold. Leonard had inherited this empire at 21, when his father's heart gave out during a particularly brutal cross-examination. Some said it was poetic justice for a man who'd built his fortune on the misery of others. Leonard preferred to think of it as efficient succession planning. His office occupied the entire top floor, a testament to power and isolation in equal measure. Mahogany paneling imported from Honduras lined the walls, broken only by original Picassos and Monets that most people would never see outside of museums. Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes covered sections of the marble floor. Everything was perfectly arranged, perfectly controlled, perfectly cold. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Margaret Henley, efficient and unflappable after 15 years of service, entered with her usual measured stride. At 58, she was the closest thing Leonard had to family, though neither would ever acknowledge such sentiment aloud. Her iron-grey hair was pulled into its customary chignon, her navy suit immaculate despite the weather. The temporary secretary from the agency has arrived, Mr. Ashworth. Miss Isabella Durant. Leonard didn't turn from the window. The name meant nothing to him, as it should. Temporary staff were interchangeable components in his precisely calibrated machine. They came, they served their function, they left. Margaret's surgery to repair a detached retina would keep her away for 6 weeks, during which time this replacement would handle basic administrative tasks and nothing more. He expected nothing from this one beyond competence and invisibility. Her credentials? Impeccable, sir. Top marks from Secretarial College. 5 years' experience with Manchester legal firms, excellent references. Though she seems rather subdued, Margaret's pause spoke volumes. In their 15 years together, she'd perfected the art of conveying disapproval through strategic silence. Leonard finally turned, settling into his leather chair with the fluid motion of a predator assuming position. Send her in. Margaret's heels clicked against the polished marble as she retreated. Leonard adjusted his platinum cufflinks, straightened papers that were already perfectly aligned, and prepared to conduct another tedious interview. The door opened again and she walked in. Isabella Durant was not what he expected. At 25, she possessed an old soul's wariness that showed in her careful movements and downcast eyes. She wore a simple black dress that had seen better days, the fabric quality decent, but clearly not recent. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that seemed designed to hide rather than enhance, with a few rebellious strands framing a face that would have been remarkable if she'd allowed it to be. But it was her posture that caught his attention first. The way she held herself, like someone accustomed to making themselves invisible, shoulders slightly hunched as if expecting a blow. Her shoes were practical flats, recently polished but worn at the heels. No jewelry, except for a thin gold chain at her throat that disappeared beneath the neckline of her dress. Her handbag was leather but old, carried with the careful precision of someone who owned few possessions and treasured them all. Everything about her spoke of genteel poverty, of someone struggling to maintain appearances while drowning in circumstances beyond their control. Miss Durant. His voice carried the same tone he used for depositions and board meetings, measured and authoritative. I trust the agency explained your duties. She lifted her eyes briefly, meeting his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before looking away. In that brief moment, Leonard glimpsed something that made him pause. Her eyes were grey, the colour of London sky before a storm, and in their depths was a sadness so profound it seemed to have weight. Yes, sir. Temporary administrative support while your regular secretary recovers from surgery. 6 weeks, possibly 8 if complications arise. Her voice held a musical quality despite its carefully modulated volume. Northern accent, he noted, softened by years of practice but not entirely erased. Manchester, most likely, given her work history. Working-class origins attempting middle-class respectability. He'd seen it countless times before, young women fleeing industrial cities for the golden promise of London, only to discover that escape required more than geographical distance. Leonard studied her profile as she examined the chair across from his desk, waiting for permission to sit. There was something about her stillness that intrigued him, a quality that seemed both fragile and impenetrable. In his world of calculated moves and purchased loyalties, such genuineness was rare enough to be noteworthy. Most people who entered his office wanted something from him, their desires written clearly across their faces. This woman wanted nothing, expected nothing, and that made her dangerous in ways she couldn't possibly understand. Sit. She perched on the edge of the chair like a bird ready for flight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Leonard opened her file, though he'd already memorized its contents. Isabella Mary Durant, born Manchester, July 15, 1998. Parents deceased, raised by maternal grandparents, secretarial diploma, with distinction from Manchester Metropolitan University. 5 years' experience with 3 different legal firms, all providing exemplary references. He looked up to find her watching him with something that might have been surprise. You seem concerned that I've done my research, Miss Durant. In my business, information is survival. Of course, sir. I simply wasn't expecting such thoroughness for a temporary position. I don't distinguish between temporary and permanent when it comes to competence. Leonard closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Your CV indicates several job changes in Manchester. Career advancement? The question seemed to cause her physical pain. She shifted almost imperceptibly, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere near his left shoulder. Not exactly, sir. The first firm dissolved after a partner was caught embezzling. The second downsized due to economic pressures. The third, she paused, color rising in her pale cheeks. There were concerns about my ability to maintain appropriate professional boundaries. Leonard's eyebrows rose slightly. This was more interesting than he'd anticipated. Meaning? A senior partner became persistent in his attentions. When I refused to reciprocate, he suggested that my future in Manchester legal circles might be limited. Her voice remained steady, but Leonard caught the tremor beneath her composure. I decided a change of scenery might be beneficial. Sexual harassment, then, packaged in the familiar euphemisms of professional courtesy. Leonard felt a flicker of something that might have been anger on her behalf, quickly suppressed. He'd built his career on exploiting weaknesses, not championing the vulnerable. And London represents a fresh start. Something like that, sir. She met his eyes briefly, and again he caught that glimpse of profound sadness. My grandmother requires care that's more readily available here. The medical facilities are superior to those in Manchester. Leonard made a note on the pad before him, though her answer revealed nothing of professional significance. What it revealed was a young woman trapped between duty and desire, family obligation, and personal ambition. Such pressures created vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities could be exploited. You'll be handling confidential documents, Miss Durant. Corporate mergers, sensitive negotiations, privileged communications. I trust you understand the implications of discretion in my line of work. Of course, Mr. Ashworth. I signed the confidentiality agreement with the agency, and I understand that breach of trust would result in both immediate termination and legal consequences. Her phrasing was precise, professional, suggesting she'd memorize the relevant clauses. Leonard found himself oddly impressed by her thoroughness. "Margaret will show you to your station. You'll be using her desk and computer systems. I expect reports typed by day's end, correspondence filed chronologically, and calls screened according to the priority list she'll provide. My calendar is managed exclusively by Margaret, so you'll have no access to scheduling. Questions? Only one, sir. Are there any particular protocols you prefer for communication? Some executives prefer email, others written memos, still others verbal reports." Leonard considered this. Most temporary staff never bothered to ask such questions, content to stumble through their assignments with minimal effort. Her attention to detail suggested either exceptional professionalism or anxiety about making mistakes. Possibly both. Written reports for anything requiring documentation. Verbal updates for routine matters. Email only for urgent communications that can't wait for face-to-face contact. He paused, studying her face. "And Miss Durant? I don't tolerate mistakes, oversights, or excuses. Excellence is the minimum acceptable standard here." She nodded once, a sharp motion that suggested military precision. "Understood, sir." She rose with the same careful grace that had marked her entrance, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. As she reached the door, Leonard found himself speaking again. "Miss Durant." She turned, and for a moment their eyes met fully. Hers were grey as storm clouds, he realized, with flecks of silver that caught the light from the windows. Something flickered in their depths, quickly suppressed, but not before Leonard recognized it as defiance. This woman was not as submissive as she appeared, not as broken as she pretended to be. "Welcome to Ashworth and Associates." She nodded once and disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind only the faintest trace of lavender perfume and an inexplicable sense that something in his perfectly ordered world had shifted. Leonard remained motionless for several minutes after her departure, staring at the closed door as if it might reveal the secrets she carried with her. The weeks that followed established a routine that Leonard found both comfortable and oddly unsettling. Isabella Durant proved herself competent beyond expectations, arriving each morning at precisely 8:30, regardless of weather or transport delays. Her typing was flawless, her organization meticulous, her discretion absolute. She handled phone calls with professional courtesy that somehow managed to be both warm and impersonal. Difficult clients found themselves soothed by her voice, while persistent salespeople discovered polite but implacable resistance. What disturbed Leonard's equilibrium wasn't her performance, but her presence. She moved through his office like a ghost, efficient and nearly silent. Her footsteps on the marble were whisper-soft, her movements economical and precise. When he spoke to her, she responded with appropriate deference but never lingered for conversation. She never laughed at his rare attempts at humor, never complimented his expensive suits or impressive office, never displayed any of the subtle signs of attraction that most women couldn't entirely suppress in his presence. It was her very immunity to his considerable charm that began to fascinate him. He started observing her more closely, noting the way she ate lunch alone at her desk, reading paperback novels with worn covers. The titles were eclectic, ranging from Victorian literature to contemporary fiction, all bearing the characteristic creases and dog-eared pages of books read multiple times. She never ate with other staff members, politely declining invitations to join lunch groups or after-work drinks. When colleagues stopped by her desk for friendly chat, she responded with courtesy, but never encouraged extended conversation. Leonard found himself timing his movements through the office to coincide with opportunities to observe her. He watched her through the glass walls of his office as she worked, noting the way she unconsciously bit her lower lip when concentrating, how she absently tucked escaped strands of hair behind her ear when stressed. Her expressions were subtle but readable once he learned the signs. A slight tightening around her eyes when dealing with difficult callers, the barely perceptible slump of her shoulders during particularly busy days, the way her hands stilled on the keyboard when she thought no one was watching. The other staff members spoke of her in hushed, respectful tones. She was unfailingly polite, they reported, helpful without being intrusive, professional without being cold. But she remained a mystery, revealing nothing of her personal life or thoughts beyond the basic biographical information in her file. Even Margaret, who could extract confessions from granite, admitted to learning nothing of significance about their temporary replacement. "She's competent," Margaret told Leonard during one of their weekly progress calls. "Perhaps more competent than I expected. But there's something—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "She seems terribly alone, sir. Not lonely exactly, but alone. As if she's wrapped herself in invisible walls that no one can penetrate." Leonard found the observation uncomfortably perceptive. He'd noticed the same quality, the sense that Isabella Durant existed within a carefully constructed fortress of solitude. It was a defensive posture he recognized because he'd perfected it himself, though his walls were built from money and power rather than silence and self-denial. One evening in late October, Leonard found himself working past 10 o'clock, reviewing contracts for a merger that would net his firm millions. Hartwell Industries, a textile company with roots stretching back to the Industrial Revolution, was being absorbed by a German conglomerate. The transaction required delicate handling. As the family patriarch had insisted on certain protections for long-term employees, protections the German buyers were reluctant to honor. Leonard specialized in such complicated negotiations, finding solutions that satisfied all parties while maximizing his own firm's profits. It was work that required absolute concentration, which was why he preferred the empty offices of evening hours. No phones ringing, no meetings interrupting his train of thought, no distractions from the complex legal choreography that kept his empire profitable. The offices were empty except for security, the cleaning staff having completed their rounds hours earlier. Leonard assumed he was completely alone until he glimpsed movement through his partially open door, a subtle shift in the patterns of light and shadow that suggested another presence in the building. Rising from his chair with cat-like silence, he moved to investigate. Isabella sat at Margaret's desk in the outer office, illuminated by the pale glow of her computer screen. She wasn't typing but staring at something on the monitor, with an expression of such profound sadness that Leonard felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. From his position in the doorway, he could see her profile etched in silver light, the graceful curve of her neck, the way her lips were pressed together, as if holding back words or tears. Her hands lay motionless on the desk, fingers curled slightly inward in unconscious self-protection. Everything about her posture spoke of defeat, of someone crushed beneath burdens too heavy to bear alone. Leonard approached silently, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. From behind her shoulder, he could see what held her attention, a hospital website, specifically a page detailing payment plans for extended care facilities. The figures displayed were staggering monthly fees that would consume most people's entire salaries, with nothing left over for basic living expenses. "Working late, Miss Durant?" She started violently, her hand flying to her throat as she spun in her chair. For a moment, her careful composure cracked completely, revealing something raw and frightened in her face. Her breathing came in quick, shallow gasps, and Leonard realized he'd genuinely terrified her. "Mr. Ashworth," her voice was barely above a whisper, "I didn't realize you were still here." Evidently, he moved around her desk, noting how she quickly minimized the browser window with trembling fingers. "Personal business on company time?" Color flooded her cheeks, a deep crimson that made her eyes seem even more luminous in the artificial light. "I apologize, sir. It won't happen again." Leonard should have issued a reprimand and dismissed her. Company policy was clear about personal internet usage, and he'd terminated employees for less significant infractions. Instead, he found himself studying the vulnerability in her downturned face, the way her hands shook as she reached for her handbag with obvious intention to flee. "Is someone ill, Miss Durant?" The question surprised them both. Leonard rarely inquired about employees' personal circumstances unless they directly affected productivity. Isabella looked up at him with those grey eyes now bright with unshed tears, and he saw something crack in her defenses. "My grandmother," she said quietly, the words seeming to cost her enormous effort. "She's in a care facility in Manchester. The fees are significant." Leonard nodded slowly, understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity. The worn clothes, the careful economy of her movements, the way she brought packed lunches rather than buying food from the building's expensive cafeterias. All symptoms of someone living on the edge of financial disaster while trying to maintain professional appearances. He could have her complete financial situation researched within hours if he chose. Could discover exactly how significant her obligations were, how close she was to complete collapse. The knowledge that he held such power over her circumstances should have been satisfying. Instead, it felt strangely hollow. I see. And your salary here is insufficient to meet these obligations? She straightened in her chair, pride warring with desperation in her expression. Leonard watched the internal battle play across her features, dignity fighting against the crushing weight of necessity. I manage, Mr. Ashworth. My personal finances won't interfere with my work. The words came out steady, but Leonard caught the slight tremor in her voice that suggested she was close to breaking point. I'm sure they won't. He paused, considering his next words with the care of a chess master, contemplating a crucial move. However, I may have a solution that would benefit us both. Something shifted in her eyes, wariness replacing vulnerability, like shutters slamming closed. Her body language changed subtly, shoulders squaring as if preparing for attack. Leonard found her defensive instincts oddly admirable, even as he prepared to exploit them. Sir, there's a contract I'm negotiating. Extremely sensitive, worth several million to the firm. It requires someone with exceptional attention to detail to draft certain clauses, someone who can work discreetly and efficiently under pressure. Leonard moved closer, studying her face for reactions. The additional compensation for such work would be substantial. More than substantial, in fact. Isabella remained silent, but her breathing had quickened almost imperceptibly. Leonard could see her mind working, calculating possibilities and dangers with the rapid precision of someone accustomed to survival mathematics. What would be required of me? Her voice was barely above a whisper, and Leonard knew she understood that he wasn't talking about legal work. He moved closer still, near enough that he could see the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat, could catch the faint scent of her perfume, mixing with something uniquely her. Close enough to see that her grey eyes held flecks of silver and blue, like sunlight on storm-churned water. Complete discretion, absolute loyalty, and a willingness to accommodate unconventional working arrangements. Leonard kept his voice pitched low, intimate, letting the implications speak for themselves. She stood abruptly, putting the chair between them like a physical barrier. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes blazed with something Leonard recognized as fury carefully held in check. I'm not sure I understand. Mr. Ashworth. But she did understand, Leonard realized with dark satisfaction. Her body language spoke of recognition and fear in equal measure. She knew exactly what he was suggesting, even if he hadn't voiced it explicitly. The question now was whether desperation would overcome dignity. Think about it, Mr. Ant. Your grandmother's care could be secured indefinitely. Your own financial struggles could become a thing of the past. All for one evening's work. Leonard smiled, the expression cold and predatory. I'm offering you a solution to all your problems. The words hung in the air between them, like smoke from a fire that would consume them both. Isabella's face had gone pale as winter moonlight, her hands gripping the back of her chair so tightly that her knuckles showed white through the skin. Leonard could see her rapid pulse in the hollow of her throat, could sense the war being fought behind those storm-grey eyes. And if I refuse? Leonard's smile widened, showing teeth. Then you refuse. Your employment here ends when Margaret returns from leave as originally planned. Your grandmother's care continues to be your own responsibility, along with whatever consequences that might entail. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Leonard had researched her financial situation thoroughly, knew exactly how precarious her circumstances were. She was drowning in debt, struggling to meet payments that would only increase as her grandmother's condition deteriorated. Without the additional income his proposition offered, she would lose everything. She closed her eyes and Leonard watched emotions play across her features like shadows cast by firelight. Pain, fury, desperation, and something else, something that looked almost like relief. When she opened her eyes again, something had hardened in their grey depths, a resolution that seemed to crystallize the very air around her. I need time to consider. Of course. Leonard returned to his chair, settling back with the satisfied air of a hunter who had successfully cornered his prey. Take all the time you need, Mr. Ant, but remember that opportunities like this rarely present themselves twice. She gathered her belongings with shaking hands, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Leonard watched her struggle with obvious enjoyment, savoring the moment of complete power over another human being. At the door she paused without turning back. "You're a bastard, Mr. Ashworth." Leonard's smile widened. "Yes, Miss Durant, I am." After she left, he remained in the empty office, staring out at the glittering lights of London spread below like a carpet of fallen stars. The Thames wound through the city like a dark ribbon, carrying the accumulated sins of centuries toward the sea. Somewhere in that vast sprawl, Isabella Durant was walking home to whatever modest accommodation she could afford, wrestling with the impossible choice he'd placed before her. He should have felt triumphant, having cornered her so neatly between desire and necessity. The elegant simplicity of his trap pleased the strategic part of his mind that approached every human interaction as a battle to be won. Instead, the taste of victory was strangely bitter on his tongue, leaving him restless and unsatisfied. Leonard poured himself 3 fingers of 25-year-old Macallan from the crystal decanter on his credenza and settled back in his chair to contemplate the cityscape. Tomorrow Isabella would return to work, and the game would begin in earnest. She would struggle with her decision, perhaps attempt to find alternative solutions, but ultimately she would capitulate. They always did, when the pressure became sufficient. The following days passed with excruciating tension that seemed to electrify the very air of the office. Isabella performed her duties with mechanical precision, speaking to him only when absolutely necessary and never meeting his eyes. The careful distance she'd always maintained became an Arctic divide that seemed to freeze the very atmosphere between them. Her greeting each morning was pitched precisely at professional courtesy, neither warm nor cold, revealing nothing of the turmoil Leonard knew must be raging beneath her composed surface. Leonard found himself studying her constantly, noting every tiny change in her demeanor, with the obsessive attention of a scientist observing a crucial experiment. The way she'd begun eating even less at lunch, picking at sandwiches before throwing them away untouched. The shadows under her eyes that suggested sleepless nights, spent wrestling with impossible decisions. The tremor in her hands when she placed documents on his desk, careful not to let their fingers brush. He was destroying her, slowly and methodically, and the knowledge should have satisfied him. Instead, it created an ache in his chest that he refused to acknowledge as guilt. Leonard Ashworth had built his fortune on the calculated destruction of others, had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet something about Isabella Durant's quiet suffering disturbed his equilibrium in ways he didn't care to examine. A week after their late-night conversation, she knocked on his office door at closing time. Leonard looked up from his computer to find her standing in the doorway, still and pale as a marble statue. The office was empty except for them, the late autumn sunset casting long shadows across the marble floor. "Come in, Miss Durant." She entered and closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch sounding final as a coffin lid. When she turned to face him, her expression was utterly blank. All emotion leached from her features as if she'd willed herself to feel nothing. "I've made my decision." Leonard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled before him in an attitude of casual attention. Inside his chest something hot and predatory stirred to life. "And? I accept your proposition." The words came out in a rush as if she were afraid of losing her nerve. "But I have conditions." This was entirely unexpected. Leonard raised an eyebrow, genuine surprise flickering across his features before he could suppress it. In his experience, people in Isabella's position were grateful for whatever terms were offered, lacking the leverage to negotiate anything beyond basic dignity. "You're hardly in the position to negotiate terms, Miss Durant." "Perhaps not." She moved closer to his desk, and Leonard saw that her hands were steady now, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I won't be treated like a common prostitute. If you want me, you'll have me on my terms." Leonard felt something hot and dangerous unfurl in his chest, a mixture of arousal and admiration that he hadn't expected. This woman was not as submissive as she appeared, not as broken as she pretended to be. The defiance blazing in her eyes was magnificent, transforming her from prey into something far more interesting. "What terms?" "One night, as you said. But not here, not in your office or some anonymous hotel room where you can treat it like a business transaction." She lifted her chin, defiance blazing in those storm-grey eyes. "Somewhere of my choosing. And we do this as equals, not as employer and employee." "Interesting." Leonard rose from his chair, moving around the desk until he stood directly in front of her. She didn't retreat, though he could see the effort it cost her to hold her ground. "And what makes you think you have any power in this situation?" She met his gaze steadily, unflinching despite the obvious cost to her composure. "Because you want me, Mr. Ashworth. Not just any woman, not just a body to use and discard. You want me specifically, or you wouldn't have made this elaborate proposition. You could have hired any prostitute in London for far less than you're offering me." Leonard felt his carefully maintained control slip for just a moment. Surprise flickering across his features before he could suppress it. She'd seen through him with uncomfortable accuracy, recognizing the obsession that had been growing like a cancer in his chest for weeks. The admission that his desire was personal rather than merely transactional shifted the balance of power between them in subtle but significant ways. "Very well," he said softly, his voice dropping to the intimate register he reserved for boardroom negotiations and bedroom conquests. "Your terms are acceptable. Where and when?" "There's a cottage in the Cotswolds. It belonged to my parents before they died. I still have the key." Her voice softened slightly, betraying the first hint of genuine emotion she'd shown. "This weekend. Saturday evening." Leonard nodded, already calculating travel time and logistics. "I'll arrange for the payment to be transferred to your account immediately." "No." The sharpness in her voice surprised him. "After. Payment comes after, not before. I won't be bought in advance like a commodity." She turned toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. When she looked back at him, something had changed in her expression, a hardness that made her seem older, more experienced in ways that had nothing to do with years. "And Mr. Ashworth, bring wine, good wine. If I'm going to sell myself, I intend to be properly intoxicated for it." The door closed behind her with a quiet click, leaving Leonard alone with the implications of what he'd set in motion. He should have felt victorious, having finally cornered his prey into submission. Instead, he felt like a man who'd just agreed to walk into a trap of his own devising, drawn forward by desires he didn't fully understand and couldn't entirely control. Outside his windows, London glittered in the darkness, like a city of fallen angels, beautiful and cold and utterly indifferent to the games played by its inhabitants. Leonard poured himself another whiskey and tried to ignore the voice in his head that whispered he was about to make the biggest mistake of his carefully controlled life. But as he sat in his leather chair, staring out at the night, he couldn't bring himself to care about consequences or complications. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, electric with anticipation, and something that might have been fear. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Saturday arrived with the kind of autumnal perfection that made England seem like a painting come to life. Golden light filtered through amber leaves, and the air carried that crisp bite that promised winter's approach. Leonard stood in his Mayfair penthouse, adjusting platinum cufflinks with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, given what he was about to do. He'd barely slept, spending the night alternating between anticipation and something that felt dangerously close to conscience. The rational part of his mind catalogued the risks he was taking, the boundaries he was crossing, the potential consequences of mixing business with such primal desires. But rationality had abandoned him weeks ago, replaced by an obsession that grew stronger with each passing day. Leonard had built his empire on control, on the ability to manipulate situations and people with surgical precision. Yet Durant had somehow slipped beneath his defenses, creating chaos in the ordered machinery of his existence. She was nothing like the sophisticated women he usually took to bed, those polished creatures who understood the rules of engagement and expected nothing beyond mutual pleasure and expensive gifts. Isabella was dangerous precisely because she wanted nothing from him beyond survival. Her desperation made her honest in ways that wealth couldn't touch, and her honesty made her unpredictable. Leonard found himself simultaneously thrilled and terrified by the unknown territory he was entering. His Aston Martin DB11 waited in the underground garage, its pewter finish gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Leonard had chosen it deliberately, rejecting the obvious power statement of the Bentley or the flashy aggression of the Ferrari. Today required subtlety, at least the appearance of restraint. He dressed with similar calculation: charcoal wool, trousers, a cream cashmere sweater, Italian leather jacket that cost more than most people earned in a month. Expensive but understated, powerful without being ostentatious. The wine selection had required considerable thought. He'd finally settled on a 1996 Chateau Margaux, a vintage that spoke of sophistication without arrogance, complexity without pretension. The bottle now rested in a temperature-controlled case on the passenger seat, along with provisions he'd acquired from Harrods: artisanal cheeses, French bread still warm from the oven, chocolates from Belgium that cost more per pound than silver. Leonard wasn't sure why he'd gone to such elaborate lengths for what was essentially a business transaction. Perhaps he was trying to preserve some illusion of romance, to convince himself that what they were doing had meaning beyond the purely mercenary. Or perhaps he simply wanted to see how Isabella would react to such obvious displays of wealth, whether luxury could crack the armor of her carefully maintained dignity. The drive to the Cotswolds took 2 hours through countryside that grew increasingly picturesque with each passing mile. Rolling hills dotted with stone cottages, ancient churches rising from medieval villages, sheep grazing in fields bordered by dry stone walls built by hands centuries dead. Leonard had made this journey countless times to his own country estate, but today the familiar landscape seemed charged with significance, as if the very air hummed with possibility and danger. Isabella had provided surprisingly detailed directions, her handwriting precise and economical, on the cream-colored paper she'd left on his desk Friday evening. The cottage was located outside a village called Bourton-on-the-Water, accessible only by narrow lanes that twisted between hedgerows, thick with blackberries and elderflower. Leonard found the turning easily enough, following a track that led through a copse of ancient oak trees to a clearing where the cottage waited like something from a fairy tale. Built of honey-colored Cotswold stone, with a slate roof softened by moss, surrounded by a garden gone slightly wild with neglect, it seemed to exist outside of time itself. Isabella's car was already there, a decade-old Vauxhall Corsa that had seen better days, parked beside a wooden gate that hung slightly askew on weathered hinges. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light spilled from diamond-paned windows, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that seemed at odds with the charged nature of their arrangement. Leonard sat in his car for several minutes, studying the cottage and trying to reconcile this picture of rustic charm with his image of Isabella Durant. She'd spoken of the place as belonging to her parents, but Leonard had assumed she meant some modest suburban semi-detached house. This cottage was something else entirely, speaking of old money or at least old gentility, of roots that reached deep into English soil. Finally, he gathered his courage and his gifts, walking up the gravel path to a front door painted the deep green of forest shadows. Before he could knock, the door opened, and Isabella appeared in the entrance like an apparition materialized from his dreams. She had transformed herself completely. Gone was the severe bun and shapeless black dress of the office. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, catching the light from within the cottage and revealing auburn highlights Leonard had never noticed. She wore a simple dress of deep burgundy wool that clung to curves he'd only imagined, its neckline modest but somehow more alluring than the most provocative designer gown. But it was her eyes that stopped him completely. Without the shield of professional distance, they blazed with intelligence and something that might have been challenge. She'd applied makeup with subtle skill, enhancing rather than masking her natural beauty, and Leonard realized with shocking clarity that Isabella Durant was stunning. Not in the artificial way of the women he usually desired, but with a natural elegance that made his chest tight with want. Mr. Ashworth. Her voice carried none of the deference of their office interactions. Here, in this place that belonged to her past, she was someone else entirely. "You're precisely on time." "Leonard," he said, surprised by the roughness in his own voice. "If we're doing this, we should at least use first names." She stepped aside to let him enter, and Leonard found himself in a sitting room that took his breath away. Low-beamed ceilings, walls lined with books whose leather spines spoke of decades, of careful reading, furniture that was clearly antique but worn in the way that suggested use rather than neglect. A fire crackled in an inglenook fireplace, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs that had probably been bought by her grandparents' generation. "This is beautiful," Leonard said, setting down the wine and provisions on a table that might have been Jacobean. "How long has it been in your family?" "4 generations." Isabella moved with unconscious grace through the familiar space, adjusting cushions that didn't need adjusting, straightening books that were already perfectly aligned. Nervous energy radiated from her, despite her composed exterior. "My great-grandfather bought it in 1923 with money he made importing tea from Ceylon. My grandparents used it as a holiday cottage, and my parents—" She paused, something flickering across her face. "My parents brought me here every summer until I was 8. Until they died." Yes, the word came out sharp, definitive. After that it was too expensive to maintain properly. My grandparents paid the taxes and kept it weatherproofed, but no one lived here. I've been coming occasionally since I turned 18, usually when I need to think. Leonard studied her as she spoke, noting the subtle changes in her posture and voice. Here, surrounded by family history and childhood memories, she seemed more substantial somehow, less fragile than the woman who submitted reports with trembling hands. This was Isabella Durant's true self, he realized, the person she might have been if circumstance hadn't forced her into servitude. "The wine," she said suddenly, as if just remembering why they were there. "You mentioned bringing wine." Leonard retrieved the bottle from its case, watching her face as she read the label. Her eyes widened slightly, and he caught a glimpse of genuine surprise before she controlled her expression. "Chateau Margaux. 1996. She looked up at him with something that might have been amusement. "Trying to impress me, Leonard?" The sound of his name in her voice did something uncomfortable to his chest. "Is it working?" "Perhaps." She moved to a sideboard that held crystal glasses that caught the firelight like captured stars. "Though I should warn you, I know enough about wine to recognize when someone's trying too hard." Leonard found himself smiling despite the tension. "And am I trying too hard?" "Magnificently." She returned with 2 glasses, standing close enough that he could smell her perfume mixed with something uniquely her. "But I appreciate the effort." The wine opened with the satisfying pop of a cork that had waited 26 years for this moment. Leonard poured with the practiced skill of someone who understood that great wine was ceremony as much as consumption, watching the deep ruby liquid catch the light as it filled the crystal bowls. Isabella accepted her glass with hands that were steady now, raising it in a toast that seemed to mock their circumstances. "To unconventional working arrangements." "To unconventional working arrangements," Leonard echoed, touching his glass to hers with the soft chime of crystal against crystal. The wine was extraordinary, complex and sophisticated with layers of flavor that revealed themselves slowly. Leonard watched Isabella taste it, noting the way she closed her eyes to concentrate on the experience, how her lips curved in unconscious appreciation. She knew wine, he realized, had been taught to recognize quality by people who understood such things. "Tell me about your parents," Leonard said, settling into a chair by the fire. The cottage's warmth was seeping into his bones, creating an intimacy that felt more dangerous than any bedroom. "What did they do?" Something shuddered in Isabella's expression, but she answered with apparent composure. "My father was a consultant, specializing in corporate restructuring. My mother taught literature at the local comprehensive school. They met at university, married young, bought this cottage as a wedding gift to themselves." She sipped her wine, staring into the fire. "They were happy, I think, at least until the end. How did they die?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Isabella was silent for so long that Leonard wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "Car accident. Late at night, coming back from London after my father had meetings there. The police said he fell asleep at the wheel, but—" She shrugged with studied casualness. "My father was an excellent driver. He'd driven that road hundreds of times." Leonard felt something cold settle in his stomach. Car accidents could be arranged, especially for people who knew inconvenient secrets. His father's firm had been involved in more than one such incident, though Leonard had been too young to understand the full implications at the time. "You don't believe it was an accident?" I believe my father was under tremendous pressure in the weeks before he died. He'd been working on something that kept him up nights, made him jump every time the phone rang. My mother was worried, but he wouldn't tell her what was wrong. Isabella's knuckles were white around her wine glass. 3 days after the funeral, men in expensive suits came to the cottage. They went through all his papers, took boxes of files, said it was routine, clearing up his professional obligations. Leonard's blood turned to ice water. He knew exactly what men in expensive suits taking files meant, could even guess which firm they'd represented. The timeline would be easy enough to verify if he had the stomach for it. Did you ever find out what he was working on? No, and after a while I stopped trying. Isabella drained her wine glass in one long swallow, then held it out for a refill. I was 8 years old, Leonard. All I wanted was to understand why my parents were never coming home. The use of his first name again, combined with the raw pain in her voice, did something to Leonard that he didn't recognize. He'd built his life on exploiting others' vulnerabilities, but Isabella's grief felt sacred somehow, too pure to be touched by his corruption. He refilled her glass with hands that weren't entirely steady, then moved to the sideboard, where she'd arranged the food he'd brought. The simple act of preparing a meal together felt strangely intimate, more personal than many sexual encounters he'd experienced. You didn't have to bring all this, Isabella said, joining him as he arranged cheese and bread on plates that were clearly family heirlooms. I could have cooked. I wanted to. The admission surprised him with its honesty. I wanted tonight to be special. She looked up at him with those grey eyes that seemed to see too much. Special? Leonard, we both know what this is. A transaction. You're paying me for something I've never given anyone else, and I'm accepting because I have no choice. Let's not pretend it's romance. Her bluntness should have been refreshing after years of dealing with people who never said what they meant. Instead, it felt like a slap, stripping away the careful illusions he'd constructed around their arrangement. Is that really what you think this is? Isn't it? Isabella moved away from him, settling back in her chair with her wine and a piece of bread she didn't seem inclined to eat. You saw weakness, vulnerability, and you exploited it. Very efficiently, I might add. You could have simply propositioned me directly. But instead you created a situation where I had no real choice but to agree. Leonard felt something hot and dangerous stir in his chest. You had a choice. You could have said no. Could I? Isabella's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Let's see. Say no to you and lose my job, my income, my grandmother's care, probably my flat as well, since I can barely afford the rent as it is. Or say yes and solve all my financial problems with one night's work. What a difficult decision. You're oversimplifying. Am I? Then explain to me how this is anything other than coercion dressed up in expensive wine and artisanal cheese. Leonard set down his glass with more force than necessary, the crystal ringing against the wooden table. Because I could have had any woman in London for far less money and far less trouble. Because I've been thinking about you every moment since the day you walked into my office. Because this isn't about power or control or even sex, though God knows I want you more than I've wanted anything in years. The words hung in the air between them like a confession, raw and unguarded in ways that made Leonard immediately regret speaking them. Isabella stared at him with something that might have been shock, her lips slightly parted, wine glass frozen halfway to her mouth. Then what is it about? She asked quietly. Leonard ran his hands through his hair, destroying the careful styling he'd spent 20 minutes perfecting that morning. I don't know. That's what terrifies me. Silence settled over the cottage like snow, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft tick of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Isabella studied him with those penetrating grey eyes, and Leonard had the uncomfortable sensation of being dissected by someone far more perceptive than he'd given her credit for. You're not what I expected, she said finally. Neither are you. Isabella rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to stand before the fire, where the light played across her face in shades of gold and crimson. I've never done this before, Leonard. Not just this transaction. Any of it. I've never let anyone see me the way you're going to see me tonight. The admission hit Leonard like a physical blow. He'd suspected her inexperience from her reactions in the office, but hearing it confirmed created a mixture of desire and protectiveness that was entirely foreign to his nature. "Why me? Why now?" Isabella turned from the fire to face him, and Leonard saw that her composure had cracked just enough to reveal the frightened girl beneath the controlled surface. "Because I'm tired of being invisible. Tired of making myself small and quiet and forgettable so that the world won't notice me enough to hurt me. Tonight, for once in my life, I want to be seen, really seen. Even if it's only because you're paying for the privilege." Leonard stood slowly, setting aside his wine with the careful precision of someone whose world was shifting beneath his feet. "Isabella, don't!" She held up a hand to stop him. "Don't say something kind or noble that we'll both regret. I know what this is, and I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. But, if we're going to do this, I need you to understand that it matters to me. It may be business to you, but it's everything to me." Leonard crossed the space between them in 3 strides, stopping close enough to see the pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat. "You think this is business to me, isn't it?" "If this were business, Isabella, I would have arranged a room at the Savoy, spent an hour or 2 taking what I paid for, then gone home to forget your name. I wouldn't have driven 2 hours to a cottage in the middle of nowhere just to sit by a fire and talk about wine and dead parents." Something flickered in her eyes, hope perhaps, quickly suppressed. "Then what do you want from me?" Leonard reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was soft as silk, warm from the fire's heat, and he could feel the fine tremor that ran through her at his touch. "Everything," he said simply. "I want everything you've never given anyone else. Not just your body, though God knows I want that too. I want your thoughts, your fears, your dreams, your secrets. I want to know what makes you laugh, what makes you cry, what you think about in the small hours of the morning when you can't sleep." Isabella's eyes had gone wide, bright with unshed tears. "You want to own me?" "Yes." Leonard's thumbs traced the high curves of her cheekbones, memorizing the architecture of her face. "But I want you to own me too. That's what terrifies me, Isabella. I've spent my entire adult life making sure no one had power over me. And then you walked into my office and destroyed 20 years of careful control in a matter of weeks." A tear slipped down her cheek, catching the firelight like liquid crystal. "This is madness." "Yes, it is." Leonard lowered his head slowly, watching her face for any sign of rejection or fear. Instead, her eyes fluttered closed, and her lips parted slightly in unconscious invitation. When his mouth touched hers, the kiss was soft as a whisper, tentative as a question. Isabella's response was immediate and electric. Her hands came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, as her lips moved against his with desperate hunger. She tasted of wine and possibility, of innocence about to be lost and passion about to be discovered. Leonard deepened the kiss, his arms coming around her to pull her against his chest. She was smaller than he'd realized, fitting against him as if she'd been designed for his embrace. Her body was soft and warm and utterly feminine, curves and hollows that invited exploration. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, foreheads touching as they struggled to regain their composure. Isabella's lipstick was smeared, her hair disheveled, and Leonard thought she'd never looked more beautiful. "That was my first kiss," she whispered, the admission torn from her as if against her will. Leonard felt something crack inside his chest. "Isabella, don't pity me." Her voice was fierce despite its tremor. "I chose this, all of it. The loneliness, the isolation, the careful distance from anything that might hurt me. But I'm choosing this too, you tonight." Leonard studied her face in the firelight, seeing strength where he'd expected fragility, determination where he'd expected submission. Isabella Durant was not the victim he'd imagined her to be, but a woman making conscious choices about her own life and body. "Are you sure?" "No," she laughed shakily, the sound catching in her throat. "I'm not sure of anything except that I can't keep living like a ghost. If I'm going to sell myself, at least let it be to someone who makes me feel alive." Leonard took her hand, marveling at how small and delicate it was in his own. "Upstairs?" Isabella nodded, leading him up a narrow staircase that creaked with age to a bedroom under the eaves. She'd prepared the space carefully, Leonard noted, with candles casting warm light across whitewashed walls, rose petals scattered across a 4-poster bed that had probably witnessed 3 generations of Durant family intimacies. The room was small and cozy, dominated by the ancient bed with its hand-embroidered coverlet. Diamond-paned windows looked out over the garden, and Leonard could hear the soft hoot of an owl in the oak trees beyond. Isabella stood in the center of the room, hands clasped before her, suddenly looking young and uncertain. The confident woman who'd challenged him downstairs had evaporated, replaced by someone who seemed almost fragile in the candlelight. Leonard moved to her slowly, as if approaching a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden movement. When he reached her, he simply stood there, drinking in the sight of her face in the golden light. "We don't have to do anything you don't want to do," he said quietly. "Contract or no contract, money or no money. Say the word and I'll drive back to London right now." Isabella searched his face as if looking for deception, then slowly reached up to touch his cheek. Her fingers were cool against his skin, trembling slightly with nerves or anticipation. "I want this," she said, and Leonard heard the truth in her voice. "I want you. Not because of the money, not because I have to. Because for the first time in my life, I want to know what it feels like to be desired." Leonard caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm before placing it flat against his chest, where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart. "You are desired, Isabella, more than you know." What followed was nothing like the clinical transaction Leonard had envisioned. Isabella's inexperience made every touch, every kiss, every whispered endearment a revelation. She approached lovemaking with the same careful attention she brought to everything else, studying his responses as if memorizing them, learning the geography of pleasure with dedicated focus. Leonard had been with countless women, sophisticated creatures who knew all the moves, all the techniques designed to drive men to distraction. But Isabella's artless honesty, her genuine surprise at her own responses, her soft cries of wonder as he showed her what her body was capable of feeling, destroyed him completely. When it was over, they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of lavender and roses, Isabella's head pillowed on Leonard's chest, as he stroked her hair with fingers that trembled with aftermath. Neither spoke for a long time, both lost in the magnitude of what had passed between them. "That wasn't what I expected," Isabella said finally, her breath warm against his skin. "What did you expect?" "Something mechanical, unpleasant but necessary. Like going to the dentist." She tilted her head to look at him, grey eyes bright with tears Leonard couldn't interpret. "I didn't expect to feel so much." Leonard tightened his arms around her, suddenly desperate to keep her close. "Isabella." "I know." She pressed a finger to his lips, silencing whatever he'd been about to say. "I know this doesn't change anything. Tomorrow we go back to London, back to your office, back to pretending this never happened. You'll pay me what you promised, and I'll use it to save my grandmother, and we'll both pretend that what just happened was purely transactional." "What if it wasn't?" The words escaped before Leonard could stop them. "What if this was something else entirely?" Isabella's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. "Then we'd both be fools, wouldn't we? You're Leonard Ashworth, millionaire lawyer who owns half of London. I'm nobody, nothing, a temporary secretary with more debts than prospects. This is a beautiful night, Leonard, but it's not a fairy tale." Leonard wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that money didn't matter, that position and class were artificial constructs that had nothing to do with what he felt when he held her, but the words died in his throat because they both knew she was right. His world would never accept someone like Isabella, and his life was too complicated, too dangerous for innocence. Instead, he pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair and breathing in the scent of her. "Stay with me tonight, all night." "Yes," she whispered against his throat. "All night." They made love again as the candles burned low, slower this time, with the desperate tenderness of people who knew they were stealing moments from an impossible situation. Isabella cried when she climaxed, tears of pleasure and pain and something that might have been grief for what they could never have. Leonard held her as she wept, his own eyes suspiciously bright, and wondered when he'd become the kind of man who could fall in love with someone he was supposed to be exploiting. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home after years of wandering in the wilderness. Dawn found them still tangled together, Leonard's expensive clothes scattered across the floor with Isabella's burgundy dress. Two people from different worlds who'd found something precious in the space between night and morning. The pale light filtering through the diamond-paned windows was soft and forgiving, casting everything in shades of pearl and rose. Isabella stirred first, stretching like a cat, before opening those remarkable grey eyes. For a moment she looked soft and drowsy and utterly content. Then reality reasserted itself, and Leonard watched her expression change as she remembered where they were and why. "Good morning," Leonard said quietly, not wanting to shatter the fragile peace of the moment. "Good morning." Isabella's voice was husky from sleep and the previous night's activities. She made no move to pull away from him, but Leonard could feel her starting to retreat emotionally, building the walls that would carry her through what came next. "Isabella, don't." She pressed her face against his chest, and Leonard felt the dampness of fresh tears. "Please don't say anything that will make this harder than it already is." Leonard wanted to tell her that he loved her, wanted to promise her everything she'd never had and everything she deserved. Instead, he held her in silence as the sun rose over the Cotswold countryside, and the real world crept steadily closer to their temporary sanctuary. By 10 o'clock, they were dressed and standing by their cars like polite strangers. Leonard had transferred the agreed-upon sum to Isabella's account using his phone, the transaction complete and documented. She'd thanked him with the same professional courtesy she might use for any business arrangement, but her eyes remained carefully averted. "I'll see you in the office Monday," she said, opening her car door with hands that shook only slightly. "Isabella." "Wait." She paused, not quite looking at him. "Yes?" Leonard wanted to say 1,000 things, wanted to throw caution aside and beg her to come away with him, to let him solve all her problems and give her the life she deserved. Instead, he said the only thing that was safe for both of them: drive carefully. She nodded once, slipped into her battered Vauxhall, and drove away without looking back. Leonard stood in the cottage garden until her car disappeared around the bend in the lane, then got into his own vehicle and began the long drive back to London. He spent the journey trying to convince himself that one night was enough, that he could return to his ordered existence and forget Isabella Durant existed beyond the professional necessity of their working relationship. But even as he told himself these comforting lies, Leonard knew that everything had changed irrevocably. Isabella Durant had touched something in him that he thought was dead, and no amount of money or power could make him forget the way she'd felt in his arms, the sound of her voice whispering his name in the darkness, the taste of her tears when she'd cried from pleasure and pain, and something that might have been love. Monday morning would come eventually, bringing with it all the complications and impossibilities of their situation. But for now, Leonard drove through the English countryside with the memory of one perfect night burning in his chest like a brand, marking him as surely as if Isabella had written her name across his soul. Monday morning arrived with the merciless punctuality of British autumn, grey skies weeping over London as commuters hurried through streets slick with rain. Leonard stood at his office window, coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the city wake below, and tried to convince himself that everything would return to normal once Isabella walked through his door. 3 days had passed since the cottage, 72 hours of restless nights and distracted days, during which Leonard had accomplished nothing more productive than wearing grooves in his Persian rugs and emptying several bottles of excellent whiskey. He'd replayed every moment of their night together with obsessive precision, from the way Isabella's eyes had widened when she tasted the wine to the soft sound she'd made when he'd first touched her with reverent hands. The memory of her tears afterward haunted him most of all. Not tears of pain or regret, but something deeper, more complex. Tears for the woman she'd been before that night, perhaps, or for the impossibility of what lay between them. Leonard understood those tears because he'd wanted to weep himself, watching the dawn light reveal the magnitude of what they'd created and destroyed in equal measure. Margaret had returned from her medical leave that morning, arriving precisely at 8, with her usual no-nonsense efficiency intact. Her eye surgery had been successful, she'd reported, and she was ready to resume her duties immediately, which meant Isabella's temporary assignment was officially concluded, her services no longer required. Leonard had nodded and made appropriate responses while his mind raced through possibilities. He could extend her contract, find reasons to keep her in the office where he could see her every day. But that would be torture for them both, and Isabella deserved better than to be trapped in the aftermath of their impossible situation. The elevator chimed, and Leonard's pulse quickened despite his attempts at professional detachment. Margaret's voice carried from the outer office, greeting someone with the warmth she reserved for people she genuinely liked. Then softer tones, familiar cadences that made Leonard's chest tight with recognition. Isabella was here. Leonard forced himself to remain at the window, projecting the image of a man absorbed in contemplation of London's skyline, rather than the arrival of a woman who'd fundamentally altered his existence. He heard the soft murmur of conversation, Margaret's efficient briefing of files that needed attention, Isabella's measured responses that revealed nothing of the storm Leonard knew must be raging beneath her composed surface. A soft knock interrupted his pretense of concentration. Leonard turned to find Isabella standing in his doorway, and the sight of her hit him with the force of physical impact. She wore the same severe black dress she'd favored before their weekend, her hair pulled back in its familiar bun, professional armor carefully reconstructed. But Leonard could see the subtle changes that spoke of their shared intimacy. The way she held herself, with fractionally more confidence, the slight flush that colored her cheeks when their eyes met, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands as she clutched a file folder. Mr. Ashworth. Her voice was steady, properly deferential, giving no hint of the woman who'd whispered his name in the darkness. I have the Henderson contracts ready for your review. The formal address stung more than Leonard had expected. 3 days ago, she'd called him by his first name, had traced patterns on his chest while speaking of dreams and fears and the weight of solitude. Now they were back to employer and employee, the gulf between them restored, as if their night together had been nothing more than elaborate fantasy. Thank you, Miss Durant. Leonard kept his own voice carefully neutral, though using her surname felt like betrayal. Please sit. Isabella approached his desk with measured steps, placing the folder precisely in the center of his blotter before settling into the chair across from him. She sat on the edge of the seat as she had during their first interview, hands clasped in her lap, eyes focused somewhere near his left shoulder. The picture of professional propriety, except for the pulse Leonard could see beating rapidly at the base of her throat. I trust you had a pleasant weekend, Leonard said, the words emerging despite his better judgment. Something flickered in Isabella's expression, quickly suppressed. Yes, sir. Very restful. And you? The careful neutrality of her response felt like a door closing, sealing away everything they'd shared. Leonard wanted to reach across the desk, to touch her face and remind her of the woman she'd been in his arms. Instead, he opened the Henderson file and pretended to review contracts he'd already memorized. These look acceptable. Please prepare the final documents for signature. Leonard closed the folder, looking up to find Isabella watching him with an expression he couldn't interpret. Is there something else? Margaret mentioned that my assignment concludes today. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to work here, and to ensure all my duties are properly transferred. Isabella's voice remained steady, but Leonard caught the slight emphasis on assignment, the subtle reminder that their professional relationship had always been temporary. Of course, Margaret will handle the transition. Leonard paused, studying Isabella's face for any sign of the woman who'd challenged him in the cottage. I trust the additional compensation we discussed will prove adequate for your needs. The euphemism hung between them like smoke. Isabella's cheeks colored slightly, but her composure never wavered. More than adequate, sir. Thank you. Leonard nodded, fighting the urge to say something, anything that might crack her professional facade. But what could he say? That he'd spent the weekend thinking about her? That he'd driven past her Manchester address twice without stopping? That the memory of her tears had kept him awake for 3 nights running? Is there anything else, Mr. Ashworth? The question was politely professional, but Leonard heard the dismissal beneath it. Isabella was ready to leave, to walk out of his office and his life with the same quiet dignity she'd brought to everything else. The thought filled him with something approaching panic. Actually, yes. The words emerged before Leonard could consider their wisdom. There may be additional projects requiring your particular skills. Would you be available for future consulting work? Isabella's hands tightened fractionally in her lap. What sort of consulting? Document review, research, the kind of detailed work you've proven excellent at handling. Leonard kept his voice carefully neutral, though they both understood the real question being asked. Flexible scheduling, competitive compensation. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across Isabella's face. Then her professional mask slammed back into place with almost audible force. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Ashworth, but I've accepted a position with another firm. I'll be starting Monday." Isabella rose from her chair with fluid grace, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled only slightly. "If you'll excuse me, I should gather my personal items." The rejection hit Leonard harder than any business failure ever had. Isabella was cutting him out of her life with surgical precision, eliminating any possibility of future contact. It was the intelligent thing to do, the safe thing, but it felt like another small death. "Of course. Best of luck in your new position." Isabella nodded once and turned toward the door. At the threshold, she paused without looking back. "Goodbye, Leonard." The use of his first name, spoken so quietly he almost missed it, felt like benediction and farewell combined. Then she was gone, leaving Leonard alone with the aftermath of his own poor choices and the growing certainty that he just made the biggest mistake of his life. The week that followed passed in a blur of mechanical routine. Leonard attended meetings, reviewed contracts, made decisions that affected millions of pounds, all while feeling as though he was performing from behind glass. Margaret watched him with increasing concern, making subtle inquiries about his health and suggesting he take a holiday. Leonard deflected her worries with practiced ease, while privately acknowledging that he was not functioning at anywhere near his usual capacity. He found himself thinking about Isabella at the most inappropriate moments. During a merger negotiation with German industrialists, he'd suddenly wondered what she was doing at that precise moment. While reviewing litigation strategy for a pharmaceutical client, he'd caught himself imagining her voice, reading the documents aloud. Twice he'd started to dial her mobile number before remembering that he had no legitimate reason to contact her. Leonard had built his life on control, on the ability to compartmentalize emotions and focus on objectives with laser precision. Isabella Durant had shattered that control as effectively as a brick through window glass, leaving him struggling to function in the wreckage of his former certainty. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected distraction in the form of his sister's unannounced visit. Vivian Ashworth Pembroke swept into his office like an elegant hurricane, all perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothing that cost more than most people's annual salaries. At 47, she remained stunning in the way that money and excellent genetics could achieve, though Leonard had learned to read the subtle signs of strain around her eyes. "Darling brother," Vivian air-kissed both his cheeks before settling into the chair Isabella had occupied 5 days earlier. "You look absolutely dreadful. Are you sleeping?" Leonard poured himself a whiskey from the crystal decanter on his credenza, noting that it was barely past 4 o'clock and caring not at all. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure, Viv? Can't I simply visit my only sibling without ulterior motives?" Vivian accepted the glass he offered, studying his face with the sharp intelligence that had made her one of London's most feared society hostesses. "Although now that you mention it, there is something I wanted to discuss." Leonard settled back in his chair, recognizing his sister's particular brand of manipulation. Vivian never made direct requests, preferring to circle her objectives like a predator, selecting the perfect moment to strike. It was a technique she'd learned from their father, along with the ability to smile while delivering devastating psychological wounds. "Mother's birthday is next month," Vivian continued, swirling her whiskey with practiced elegance. "I'm planning something intimate at the house in Surrey. Just family and a few close friends." Leonard raised an eyebrow. Lady Catherine Ashworth had been dead for 15 years, a fact that Vivian periodically seemed to forget during her more difficult periods. "Viv, I know what you're thinking, but I'm perfectly fine, Leonard. The doctors say my medication is working beautifully." Vivian's smile was bright and brittle as spun-glass. "I simply think it's important to maintain family traditions, don't you?" Leonard studied his sister's face, noting the telltale signs he'd learned to recognize over the years. The slightly dilated pupils that suggested she wasn't taking her medication as prescribed. The nervous energy that radiated from her despite her controlled posture. The way her hands moved constantly, adjusting her jewelry, smoothing her hair, never quite still. "Perhaps we could discuss this another time," Leonard suggested gently. "When you're feeling more settled." "I am perfectly settled, thank you." Vivian's voice sharpened, and Leonard glimpsed the fury that always lurked beneath her polished surface. Just because I choose to honor our family doesn't mean I'm having an episode, Leonard. You always assume the worst about me. Leonard sighed, recognizing the familiar pattern of their conversations. Vivian's grip on reality had been tenuous since their father's death, made worse by a series of failed marriages and the gradual erosion of her trust fund through poor investments and expensive treatments. She lived in a carefully constructed fantasy where their family remained intact and their mother still presided over elegant dinner parties in Surrey. I'm sorry, Viv. You're right. Tell me about your plans. Vivian's expression brightened immediately, the transition so rapid it was almost frightening. I was thinking something classical, you know. String quartet, champagne reception, all Mother's favorite flowers. She always said October roses were the most beautiful, because they knew they were dying. The comment sent an unexpected chill through Leonard. Their mother had indeed loved autumn roses, had filled the Surrey house with them every October, until the cancer took her voice and then her life. But Vivian's version of their mother bore little resemblance to the cold, calculating woman who'd actually raised them. That sounds lovely, Leonard lied, already calculating how to handle the inevitable disaster when Vivian's fantasy collided with reality. Who were you thinking of inviting? Oh, the usual suspects. The Pemberton Joneses, the Cartwrights, perhaps the new family that bought the Whitmore estate. Vivian paused, studying Leonard with sudden intensity. You should bring someone, darling. It's been ages since we've met any of your companions. Leonard nearly choked on his whiskey. I'm not seeing anyone at the moment. Don't be ridiculous. A man like you, successful, attractive, wealthy? There's always someone. Vivian leaned forward conspiratorially. I heard from Charlotte Pemberton Jones that you were seen at Harrods last Saturday, buying rather expensive wine. She said you looked positively romantic, if such a thing can be imagined. Leonard's blood turned cold. He'd indeed been at Harrods that Saturday morning, selecting the Chateau Margaux for his evening with Isabella. The thought that his movements were being observed and reported made him want to check every shadow for potential surveillance. Charlotte Pemberton Jones should find more productive ways to occupy her time, Leonard said carefully. So there is someone. Vivian clapped her hands with childlike delight. How wonderful! What's she like? Do I know her family? Leonard considered his options and decided that deflection was his only viable strategy. Vivian, even if I were seeing someone, which I'm neither confirming nor denying, it would be far too early to introduce her to family gatherings. Nonsense. Mother always said you could judge a person's character by how they handled family dynamics. Bring her to the birthday celebration, Leonard. I promise to be on my very best behavior. The thought of subjecting Isabella to his sister's particular brand of madness was horrifying enough. The realization that he was even considering it, despite their relationship being definitively concluded, suggested that his own grip on reality might be slipping. We'll see, Leonard said, hoping to end the conversation before it veered into even more dangerous territory. Vivian smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd achieved her objective, though Leonard wasn't entirely sure what that objective had been. After she left, trailing expensive perfume and subtle menace, he remained at his desk long after the building had emptied around him. The weekend brought no relief from his obsessive thoughts about Isabella. Leonard found himself driving aimlessly through London's streets, unconsciously following routes that might take him past her flat or the coffee shop where she'd mentioned buying her morning tea. He never actually sought her out, but the possibility of accidental encounter seemed to draw him like gravity. Sunday evening found him in his study, supposedly reviewing case files, but actually staring at his laptop screen where Isabella's employment file remained open. He'd memorized every detail weeks ago, but found himself studying her photograph with the focus of someone trying to decode ancient hieroglyphics. The phone rang, jolting him from his reverie. Margaret's name appeared on the caller ID, unusual given that she rarely contacted him on weekends, unless facing genuine emergencies. Margaret. What's wrong? I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Ashworth, but I thought you should know immediately. Margaret's voice carried an tension Leonard had rarely heard from his unflappable assistant. It's about Miss Durant. Leonard's chest constricted. What about her? I was cleaning out the old filing cabinets today, preparing space for the new digital storage system you approved. In the bottom drawer of the cabinet in storage room C, I found a folder that had fallen behind the other files. Margaret paused, and Leonard could hear papers rustling. Mr. Ashworth, it contains documents relating to a Marcus Durant dated 17 years ago. The name hit Leonard like physical blow. Marcus Durant, Isabella's father, the consultant who died in that convenient car accident when she was 8 years old. Leonard's throat felt suddenly dry. What sort of documents? Correspondence, mostly. Letters between your father and Mr. Durant regarding something called Project Nightingale. There are also what appear to be financial records, payments made to shell companies I don't recognize. Margaret's voice dropped to just above a whisper. Mr. Ashworth, some of these documents are marked with your father's personal seal, the one he only used for the most sensitive matters. Leonard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of family history settling on his shoulders like lead blankets. Project Nightingale. The name triggered fragmented memories of hushed conversations between his parents, of his father working late into the night during Leonard's university years, of phone calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room. Are you certain they relate to Isabella's father? The address matches the one in Miss Durant's employment file, and there are references to a daughter named Isabella. Margaret's voice carried a note of something that might have been pity. Mr. Ashworth, I think you need to see these documents immediately. Leonard stared out at the London skyline, watching lights flicker on in countless windows as families gathered for Sunday dinner, and felt his carefully ordered world shifting on its axis. Isabella had mentioned her father's suspicious death, the pressure he'd been under in his final weeks, the mysterious men who'd taken his papers after the funeral. Those men had probably worked for Ashworth and Associates. I'll be there in an hour, Leonard said, already reaching for his coat. Don't let anyone else see those files, Margaret. No one. The drive to the office passed in a blur of city lights and growing dread. Leonard's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had his father been involved in Marcus Durant's death? Had Leonard unknowingly benefited from the destruction of Isabella's family? The woman he'd fallen in love with might be the daughter of a man his own family had murdered. The Ashworth building loomed against the night sky like a monument to accumulated sins. Leonard's security card granted him access to floors that stood empty and dark, his footsteps echoing through marble corridors that had witnessed decades of legally sanctioned destruction. Margaret waited in the storage room, surrounded by bankers' boxes and filing cabinets that contained the archaeological layers of the firm's history. She looked older than Leonard had ever seen her, the weight of discovery aging her before his eyes. I've laid out the most significant documents on the table, she said quietly. Leonard, I've worked for this family for 15 years. I've seen things, heard things, kept secrets that would destroy lives. But this... Leonard approached the table where papers were arranged in careful chronological order. His father's handwriting, instantly recognizable after all these years, filled margins and letterheads. Marcus Durant's responses, typed on letterhead from his small consulting firm, showed the evolution from professional cooperation to growing desperation. The earliest documents dated from Leonard's final year at Cambridge, when he'd been focused on law review and graduation rather than family business. Project Nightingale appeared to involve the acquisition of several textile companies in Manchester. Legitimate business on the surface, but clearly involving questionable methods beneath. Marcus Durant had been hired to assess the financial health of target companies, to identify weaknesses that could be exploited during hostile takeover attempts. But as the project progressed, Durant's reports showed increasing concern about the human cost of the acquisitions. Factories closed, workers dismissed without adequate compensation, pension funds mysteriously depleted. Leonard found a letter dated 3 weeks before Marcus Durant's death, written in handwriting that grew increasingly agitated as it progressed. Mr. Ashworth, I cannot continue to be party to the destruction of these communities. The methods you've suggested for accelerating the Hartwell Industries acquisition go beyond aggressive business practice into what I can only describe as criminal activity. I must respectfully withdraw from this project, effective immediately. His father's response was typed on personal letterhead, cold and precise as a surgical instrument. Mr. Durant, I fear you misunderstand the nature of our arrangement. Your withdrawal at this juncture would create significant complications for all parties involved. I trust you will reconsider your position keeping in mind your responsibilities to your young daughter's future. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Leonard could imagine his father dictating the letter with the same calm precision he'd used for everything else, never raising his voice but making the consequences of non-compliance perfectly clear. The final document in the sequence was Marcus Durant's death certificate, filed just 3 days after his last letter to Leonard's father. Cause of death, vehicular accident due to driver fatigue. But clipped to the certificate was a newspaper clipping about the crash, describing how Marcus Durant's car had left the motorway at precisely the point where protective barriers were under repair. Leonard stared at the document spread before him, feeling something die in his chest. His father hadn't just been involved in Marcus Durant's death. He'd orchestrated it with the same methodical precision he'd applied to every other obstacle in his path. "There's more," Margaret said quietly, producing another folder. Financial records showing payments to a security firm that specialized in what they euphemistically called problem resolution. The amounts matched the timeline of Mr. Durant's death exactly. Leonard sank into one of the storage room chairs, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his family's crimes. Isabella's father hadn't died in a random accident. He'd been murdered for refusing to participate in the destruction of working-class communities. The woman Leonard loved was the orphaned daughter of one of his father's victims. "Margaret, no one else can see these documents. Ever." "What are you going to do?" Leonard looked up at his assistant, seeing genuine concern in her eyes alongside professional loyalty. Margaret had been with the firm long enough to understand the implications of what they'd discovered. The lawsuits and criminal investigations that could follow if these documents became public. "I don't know yet, but Isabella can never learn about this, never." Margaret nodded slowly, though Leonard could see doubt in her expression. They both understood that secrets this large had a way of surfacing eventually, usually at the worst possible moment. Leonard spent the rest of the night in his office, reading and rereading the documents until he'd memorized every damning detail. By dawn, he'd made his decision. The Project Nightingale files would be destroyed, their contents erased from official memory, as if they'd never existed. It was the only way to protect Isabella from a truth that would destroy her. But even as he fed documents into the industrial shredder in the basement, Leonard knew he was only delaying the inevitable. Truth had a way of surfacing, particularly truths involving money and murder. Isabella would learn about her father's death eventually, would discover the role Leonard's family had played in her destruction. When that moment came, Leonard would lose her forever. But at least she would be spared the immediate pain of knowing that the man she'd given herself to was the son of her father's killer. As he watched the last of the documents disappear into mechanical teeth, Leonard wondered if love could survive such monstrous revelation. He suspected he was about to find out. The week that followed passed in a haze of guilt and growing paranoia. Every phone call might bring news that someone else had discovered the Project Nightingale connection. Every knock on his door could herald investigators seeking answers about decades-old crimes. Leonard found himself studying the faces of long-time employees, wondering which of them might have additional knowledge about his father's activities. Most torturous of all were the moments when he caught himself thinking about Isabella, wondering what she was doing, whether she ever thought about their night together. He'd driven past the building housing her new employer twice, fighting the urge to go inside and see her face again. Friday brought another unwelcome surprise in the form of a phone call from his banker. Simon Whitmore, Ashworth family financial advisor for 3 generations, requested an immediate meeting to discuss what he termed irregularities in some of the firm's historical accounts. Leonard agreed to meet at his private club, reasoning that neutral territory might contain whatever revelations Whitmore had uncovered. But as he sat in the library of Brooks's club, watching London's elite conduct their discreet business over brandy and cigars, Leonard felt like a man waiting for execution. Whitmore arrived precisely on time, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled in ways that suggested sleepless nights and difficult decisions. He'd been managing Ashworth family money for 15 years, had helped Leonard navigate the complexities of inheritance after his father's death. Whatever he'd discovered was serious enough to risk a relationship worth millions in annual fees. "Leonard, thank you for meeting me on such short notice." Whitmore settled into the leather chair across from him, accepting a whiskey with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. I'm afraid I have some disturbing information regarding historical transactions that may require immediate attention. Leonard kept his expression carefully neutral, though his pulse quickened. What sort of transactions? During a routine audit of dormant accounts, we discovered a series of payments made between 2006 and 2008 to companies that no longer exist. Shell corporations mostly, with registration addresses that lead nowhere. Whitmore leaned forward, lowering his voice to just above a whisper. Leonard, these payments total nearly £2 million, all authorized by your father's personal signature. £2 million. More than enough to arrange accidents, silence witnesses, and ensure that inconvenient truths remained buried. Leonard felt sick. I see. What are you suggesting we do about it? Legally, nothing. The statute of limitations has expired, and without clear evidence of criminal activity, there's no obligation to report historical irregularities. Whitmore paused, studying Leonard's face with uncomfortable intensity. But morally, Leonard, if these payments represent what I suspect they might represent, continuing to benefit from them could be problematic. Leonard understood the subtext. Whitmore knew or suspected that the Shell corporations had been involved in criminal activities, possibly including murder. He was offering Leonard the opportunity to distance himself from his father's crimes by making restitution to any surviving victims. Do you have any suggestions about how such restitution might be handled? Hypothetically, anonymous charitable donations to organizations that support the families of industrial accident victims, educational scholarships for children who lost parents under suspicious circumstances, that sort of thing. Whitmore finished his whiskey in one swallow. I could arrange everything through intermediary foundations, ensure that no connection to the Ashworth family ever became apparent. Leonard nodded slowly, understanding that this was as close to confession and absolution as the secular world could provide. By making anonymous payments to Isabella and others like her, he could perhaps balance the scales of justice without exposing the full truth of his family's crimes. Prepare a proposal. Something substantial but not so large as to raise questions. I'll review it early next week. Whitmore nodded and departed, leaving Leonard alone with his whiskey and the growing certainty that his father's sins would continue to complicate his life for years to come. But perhaps there was a way to honor Marcus Durant's memory without destroying his daughter's peace of mind. Leonard raised his glass in a silent toast to the man whose death had made possible his family's continued prosperity, and promised the empty air that Isabella Durant would never know the true cost of her father's principles. It was a promise he suspected he would live to regret, but it was the only gift he could offer to the woman he'd fallen in love with and could never have. Leonard finished his whiskey and walked out into the London evening, carrying the weight of 3 generations of Ashworth crimes on his shoulders like a coat made of lead. Behind him, the exclusive club continued its quiet business of managing the affairs of men who'd learned to live with the consequences of their choices. But Leonard knew he was different now, marked by knowledge that made him dangerous to himself and others. The game he'd started by pursuing Isabella Durant had revealed truths he'd never wanted to face. Now he had to decide whether love was worth the risk of exposure, or whether some secrets were too toxic to survive the light of day. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, calling the faithful to evening prayers. Leonard walked through streets lined with history and haunted by the ghosts of decisions made by men who'd believed they were above the reach of consequence. He was about to discover just how wrong such men could be. 3 weeks after leaving Ashworth and Associates, Isabella Durant discovered that some ghosts refused to stay buried, no matter how deep you try to bury them. She sat in the cramped bathroom of her Bermondsey flat at 6 in the morning, staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test, with the same numb shock she'd felt when the police came to tell her 8-year-old self that her parents weren't coming home. The test trembled in her hands as reality crashed over her in waves, pregnant, with Leonard Ashworth's child, the man who'd purchased one night of her virginity and then dismissed her from his life with the cold efficiency of a business transaction completed. Isabella set the test on the edge of the sink with careful precision, her mind racing through impossible calculations. She'd been meticulous about protection during their encounter, but contraception wasn't infallible, and her cycle had always been irregular under stress. The nausea she'd attributed to anxiety about starting her new job, the exhaustion she'd blamed on restless nights spent trying to forget storm-grey eyes and the taste of expensive wine. She pressed her palms against her still flat stomach, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was growing inside her. A child, Leonard's child. The product of one night that had changed everything and meant nothing, at least to him. Isabella had spent 3 weeks convincing herself that she could move on, could build a new life that didn't revolve around the memory of being held by a man who saw her as little more than a commodity to be purchased and consumed. Her new position at Hartwell & Associates offered better pay and the promise of advancement, working for senior partners who treated her with professional respect rather than predatory interest. But now, staring at undeniable evidence of their connection, Isabella realized that Leonard Ashworth would be part of her life forever. Whether he knew it or not, her mobile phone buzzed against the bathroom counter, displaying her grandmother's care facility number. Isabella answered with hands that shook only slightly, forcing warmth into her voice despite the chaos raging in her chest. "Isabella, dear, I hope I'm not calling too early." Matron Phillips's voice carried its usual note of patient professionalism, tinged with genuine concern. "I wanted to discuss your grandmother's care plan with you when you have a moment." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Of course, is everything all right?" "Medically, yes. Mrs. Durant is stable and comfortable. However, there have been some changes to the funding structure for her care level that we need to address." The matron paused delicately. "The additional payments that cleared her account last month have made a significant difference, but we'll need to discuss long-term arrangements." Additional payments. Isabella's chest tightened as she remembered Leonard's promise, the money that had appeared in her account the morning after their encounter. Blood money, she'd thought at the time, payment for services rendered. But it had saved her grandmother's care, had lifted the crushing weight of debt that had been slowly drowning her. "I understand. Can we schedule a meeting for this weekend?" "Of course, dear." "And Isabella, your grandmother has been asking for you. She's having more lucid days lately, asking about your parents, about the cottage. It might be good for her to have some family time." Isabella agreed to visit Saturday morning and ended the call with a heavy heart. Her grandmother's dementia came in waves, periods of clarity alternating with confusion that grew longer and deeper each month. On good days, she was the woman who'd raised Isabella with firm kindness after her parents' death. On bad days, she was a stranger trapped in familiar flesh, frightened by everything she no longer recognized. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that Leonard's money had bought her grandmother better care, more comfortable surroundings, medication that kept the worst symptoms at bay. She'd tried to refuse the payment at first, had even attempted to return it through the bank, but faced with eviction notices and her grandmother's deteriorating condition, pride had proven less important than survival. Now carrying his child, Isabella found herself trapped in a web of dependence that felt like slow suffocation. She could support herself, had always done so, but a baby changed everything. Childcare costs, medical expenses, the impossibility of working long hours while caring for an infant alone. The mathematics of single motherhood were brutal and unforgiving. Isabella dressed for work with mechanical precision, choosing a navy dress that disguised the slight changes in her body she'd been attributing to stress and poor eating habits. Her reflection in the hallway mirror looked pale but composed, professional armor carefully constructed to hide the turmoil beneath. The journey to her new office took her through familiar streets that held too many memories, past the cafe where she'd bought coffee during her weeks at Ashworth & Associates, past the underground station where she'd stood every morning, psyching herself up to face another day of Leonard's penetrating stare. London was too small for clean escapes, every corner holding the potential for unwanted encounters. Hartwell & Associates occupied a Georgian building in Bloomsbury, all polished brass and understated elegance that spoke of old money and older traditions. Isabella's position as senior administrative assistant to Charles Hartwell himself represented a significant step up in her career, better pay and genuine opportunities for advancement. She'd been grateful for the chance to start fresh, to work for people who saw her as a professional rather than a potential conquest. Charles Hartwell proved to be everything Leonard Ashworth wasn't: kind, paternal, interested in her ideas and opinions. At 62, he treated Isabella with the respect due a valued colleague, never making her feel like she was walking through a minefield of unwanted implications. His wife sent homemade biscuits to the office, invited Isabella to dinner, parties where conversation focused on books and politics rather than power and manipulation. Isabella. Good morning. Charles looked up from his correspondence as she entered his office, his expression warm with genuine pleasure at seeing her. How are you settling in? I hope the workload isn't too overwhelming. Not at all. Mr. Hartwell, I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Isabella arranged the morning's correspondence on his desk with practiced efficiency, noting the way her hands remained steady despite the morning's revelations. The Henderson merger documents are ready for your review, and I've scheduled the client meetings you requested for next week. Charles nodded approvingly, then studied her face with the concerned attention of someone who actually cared about his employees' well-being. You look tired, my dear. Are you getting enough rest? This transition period can be quite stressful. The kindness in his voice nearly undid Isabella's carefully maintained composure. For a moment, she was tempted to confess everything, to lay her burdens at the feet of this gentle man who might actually help her find solutions, but professional discretion held her tongue. I'm fine, thank you. Just adjusting to new routines. Charles accepted her reassurance with the polite skepticism of someone who knew when not to push. Well, if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. We consider you part of the family here. Family. The word hit Isabella with unexpected force, reminding her that the child growing inside her would need more than just financial support. A baby needed stability, security, the kind of loving environment she'd lost when her parents died. Could she provide that alone? Did she have any choice? The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks that couldn't quite distract her from the magnitude of her situation. Isabella typed reports and fielded phone calls, while her mind raced through possibilities, each scenario more daunting than the last. Tell Leonard about the pregnancy, and risk renewed contact with a man who'd made it clear their encounter meant nothing to him. Keep the secret, and raise the child alone, struggling with financial pressures that would only multiply over time. Lunchtime brought an unexpected visitor that made Isabella's decision even more complicated. She was returning from the sandwich shop when she spotted a familiar figure waiting by the building's entrance. Margaret Henley, Leonard's assistant, looking uncharacteristically uncertain as she clutched an envelope against her chest. Miss Durant. Margaret's greeting was professionally cordial, but Isabella caught the undercurrent of something that might have been concern. I hope you don't mind me coming to see you. I got your new office address from the employment agency. Isabella's pulse quickened despite her attempts at composure. Any contact with Leonard's world felt dangerous now, laden with implications she wasn't ready to face. Of course not. Is everything all right? Margaret glanced around the busy Bloomsbury Street, then leaned closer with the air of someone sharing confidential information. Could we perhaps speak privately? There's something I think you should know, something about your time with us. Isabella's chest tightened with alarm. Had Leonard discovered her pregnancy somehow? Was Margaret here on his behalf, carrying offers or threats designed to control the situation? But the older woman's expression held genuine concern rather than professional calculation. There's a coffee shop around the corner, Isabella said finally, leading Margaret to a quiet establishment where they could speak without interruption. They settled at a corner table surrounded by the comfortable bustle of office workers on lunch breaks. Margaret ordered Earl Grey with the precision of someone accustomed to taking charge, but her usual confidence seemed strained. I'm not sure how to begin, Margaret said, stirring sugar into her tea with unnecessary focus. In 15 years of working for the Ashworth family, I've kept more secrets than most people could imagine. But sometimes, Miss Durant's silence becomes complicity. Isabella felt her mouth go dry. What are you talking about? Margaret reached into her handbag and withdrew a thick envelope, placing it on the table between them like evidence in a trial. Last weekend, while reorganizing old files, I discovered documents that I believe you have a right to see. They concern your father, Marcus Durant. The name hit Isabella like a physical blow. She hadn't heard anyone speak her father's name in years, hadn't expected the sharp pain that accompanied its utterance. Her hands clenched involuntarily in her lap. My father died 17 years ago in a car accident. What could you possibly have found that relates to him? Margaret's expression grew pained. That's just it, my dear. I don't believe it was an accident at all. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that would consume everything in its path. Isabella stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it but unable to look away. She'd suspected for years that her father's death hadn't been the simple accident the police claimed, but she'd never had evidence to support her instincts. What's in there? Correspondence between your father and Leonard's father, dating from the weeks before your father died. Financial records showing payments to companies that specialized in what they euphemistically called problem resolution. A paper trail that suggests your father was murdered because he refused to participate in activities that went beyond aggressive business, practice into criminal territory. Isabella's vision blurred as tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally broke free. The confirmation of her worst suspicions should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt like being torn apart from the inside. Her father had died because he'd tried to do the right thing, had refused to be complicit in the destruction of working-class communities. Does Leonard know? The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Margaret's hesitation was answer enough. I showed him the documents last Sunday night. He ordered me to destroy everything, said you must never learn the truth. Isabella felt something cold and hard settle in her chest where her heart used to be. Leonard knew, had known for over a week, that his family had murdered her father, and his primary concern was protecting himself from the consequences of that knowledge. But you kept copies. I photographed everything before Leonard arrived at the office. I've been wrestling with my conscience ever since, trying to decide what was right. Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. Miss Durant, I've watched Leonard Ashworth for 15 years. I've seen him destroy competitors, crush witnesses, win cases through methods that would make decent people sick. But after you started working for us, something changed in him. He became human somehow, more vulnerable. I thought perhaps he was falling in love with you. Isabella laughed bitterly. Love? Is that what you call it when someone coerces an employee into prostitution? Margaret's face flushed with something that might have been shame. I knew something had happened between you two, but I didn't know the details. Leonard can be ruthless, but I never thought he would. She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. He saw an opportunity and exploited it, just like his father did with mine. Isabella reached for the envelope with hands that shook with fury rather than fear. Thank you for bringing this to me. I know it couldn't have been easy. Margaret nodded, gathering her things with the air of someone who delivered an unpleasant but necessary truth. There's something else you should know. Leonard has been in contact with the bank, making arrangements for anonymous payments to organizations that support families of industrial accident victims. I think he's trying to make restitution in the only way he knows how. Guilt money, Isabella said flatly. It doesn't bring back the dead. Margaret left without another word, leaving Isabella alone with evidence of the crime that had shaped her entire life. She sat in the coffee shop long after her tea had grown cold, reading documents that confirmed her worst fears and shattered any remaining illusions about Leonard Ashworth's character. Her father's final letters showed his growing desperation as he tried to extract himself from Project Nightingale, the industrial acquisition scheme that had required increasingly criminal methods. Marcus Durant had been an honest man, trying to support his family through legitimate consulting work, only to discover that he'd been hired to facilitate the destruction of entire communities. The financial records were even more damning, showing payments to shell companies with no legitimate business purpose beyond what Margaret had euphemistically termed problem resolution. £2 million had been paid to arrange accidents, silence witnesses, and ensure that inconvenient truths remained buried. Isabella's father had been murdered for having a conscience, for refusing to participate in the systematic destruction of working-class families, whose only crime was standing in the way of Ashworth profits. And his daughter had unknowingly given herself to the son of his killer, had allowed herself to be seduced by the very man who'd benefited from her family's destruction. The bitter irony was almost too much to bear. Isabella pressed her hands against her stomach, thinking about the child growing there, the product of her connection to her father's murderer's son. What would Marcus Durant think of his daughter carrying the grandchild of the man who'd ordered his death? Isabella remained in the coffee shop until closing time, reading and rereading documents that painted a picture of her father as a man of principle, destroyed by those who saw principle as weakness to be exploited. By the time she returned to her flat, she'd made her decision. Leonard Ashworth would pay for his family's crimes, would face the consequences of secrets he'd thought safely buried. But first, Isabella needed to be strategic, needed to plan her approach with the same calculated precision the Ashworth family had used to destroy her father. That evening, Isabella called the one person who might be able to help her navigate the complex legal and emotional terrain ahead. Solicitor Emma Patterson had been her mother's closest friend at university, had stayed in touch sporadically over the years since the funeral. More importantly, Emma specialized in corporate malfeasance and had built her reputation on taking down powerful men who thought themselves above the law. "Isabella, darling, what a lovely surprise." Emma's voice carried the warmth of genuine affection mixed with professional curiosity. "It's been far too long. How are you?" "I'm afraid I need legal advice, Emma, about my father's death." The change in Emma's tone was immediate and sharp. "Marcus? Darling, that was 17 years ago. What could possibly have come to light after all this time?" Isabella found herself telling the entire story, from her employment with Leonard to the night at the cottage to the documents Margaret had provided. Emma listened without interruption, her silence growing more ominous as the full scope of the situation became clear. "Isabella, if what you're telling me is accurate, we're talking about conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud on a massive scale and ongoing criminal enterprise spanning decades." Emma's voice had taken on the crisp efficiency she used for complex cases. "But proving it will be extraordinarily difficult, and the Ashworth family has resources that most people can't imagine." "I have documents, Emma, financial records, correspondence, evidence of payments to companies that don't exist anymore. Documents can be challenged, especially ones that are 17 years old. We'd need corroborating evidence, witnesses willing to testify, financial records that can be independently verified." Emma paused, and Isabella could hear papers rustling. "More importantly, darling, are you prepared for what this kind of case would mean? The Ashworth family won't simply roll over and confess. They'll come after you with everything they have, will try to destroy your credibility, your livelihood, your life." Isabella thought about the child growing inside her, about the responsibility she carried to ensure that her father's death hadn't been in vain. "They've already destroyed my life, Emma. I have nothing left to lose." "That's not true, and you know it. You have a career, a future, the possibility of happiness that doesn't revolve around revenge." Emma's voice softened with genuine concern. "Isabella, I loved your father like a brother, and if the Ashworth family was responsible for his death, they deserve to face justice. But seeking that justice could consume everything else in your life. Then that's a price I'm willing to pay." Emma agreed to review the documents and provide preliminary legal assessment, warning Isabella that building a case would take months or even years of careful preparation. But as Isabella hung up the phone, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since her father's death. Leonard Ashworth had awakened something in her during their night together, had shown her what it felt like to be truly alive. Now, she would use that awakened strength to seek justice for the man whose death had made Leonard's privileged existence possible. The pregnancy test still sat on her bathroom counter, 2 pink lines that had changed everything. Isabella picked it up and studied it in the harsh fluorescent light, thinking about the child who would grow up knowing that their father's family had murdered their grandfather. Some legacies, Isabella reflected, were too toxic to survive the light of truth. Leonard would soon discover just how dangerous it was to underestimate the daughter of the man he'd helped to destroy. The following week passed in a blur of clandestine meetings and careful preparation. Emma had confirmed that the documents provided compelling evidence of criminal conspiracy, but warned that prosecuting 17-year-old murders would require contemporary corroboration. "We need someone on the inside," Emma explained during their Friday evening meeting at her Lincoln's Inn chambers. Someone who worked for the Ashworth firm during the relevant period and might be willing to testify about what they saw or heard. Isabella considered the possibilities. Margaret Henley was the obvious choice, but her position made her testimony problematic. Former employees might be willing to speak, but tracking them down after nearly 2 decades would be challenging. What about financial records? Surely banks keep transaction histories that long. They do, but obtaining them requires either cooperation from the institutions involved or court orders that we can't get without prima facie evidence of criminal activity. Emma rubbed her temples, showing the strain of working on a case that grew more complex with each revelation. It's a circular problem, darling. We need evidence to get evidence. Isabella left Emma's chambers feeling discouraged, but not defeated. Justice for her father would require patience and strategy, qualities she'd learned during years of careful survival in a world that seemed designed to crush people like her. The weekend brought an unexpected development that changed everything. Isabella was visiting her grandmother at the care facility when Matron Phillips pulled her aside with obvious concern. "Isabella, your grandmother has been asking some unusual questions lately about your father, about the circumstances of his death. Yesterday she became quite agitated, insisting that she had important documents hidden somewhere that you needed to see." Isabella's pulse quickened. What kind of documents? She wasn't entirely coherent, but she kept mentioning letters, papers, that your father had given her for safekeeping before he died. She seemed to think they were still in her old house, though we both know the contents were cleared out years ago when she moved here. Isabella felt a flutter of hope. Her grandmother's house had indeed been cleared, but Isabella had packed most of the personal items herself, storing them in a self-storage unit she'd continued paying for out of sentimental attachment. If her father had left documents with his mother-in-law, they might still exist. That afternoon, Isabella made her way to the storage facility in Croydon, a depressing complex of concrete and steel that housed the accumulated memories of families who'd run out of room for their past. Unit 247 contained the archaeological layers of her grandmother's life. Furniture covered in sheets, boxes of photographs, china that had been too good for everyday use and too precious to discard. Isabella worked methodically through the stored possessions, looking for anything that might have come from her father. Near the bottom of a box containing her grandmother's correspondence, she found a manila envelope, marked in her father's familiar handwriting. "For Isabella. If anything happens to me." Isabella's hands shook as she opened the envelope, revealing documents that would change everything. Copies of the Project Nightingale correspondence, financial records showing payments to the mysterious shell companies, and most damning of all, a letter in her father's handwriting, dated 2 days before his death. If you're reading this, then my worst fears have been realized, and Richard Ashworth has made good on his threats. I've tried to extract myself from Project Nightingale, but I fear I know too much for them to simply let me walk away. The enclosed documents detail the full scope of their criminal activities, from bribery and extortion to what I can only describe as industrial terrorism. Isabella, my darling girl, use this information to ensure that justice is finally served. Don't let my death be meaningless. Isabella sank to her knees among the dusty boxes, clutching her father's final message as tears streamed down her face. He'd known he was going to die, had prepared evidence to ensure his killers couldn't escape justice. The documents he'd hidden were the smoking gun Emma needed, contemporary evidence created before the crime rather than reconstructed after it. But more than that, the letter proved that Marcus Durant had died trying to protect his daughter's future, had refused to be complicit in crimes that would have guaranteed their financial security. He'd chosen death over dishonor, had trusted that someday Isabella would be strong enough to finish what he'd started. Isabella called Emma immediately, her voice shaking with excitement and rage in equal measure. "I found them, Emma. The documents my father hid. Everything we need to prove the Ashworth family committed murder." Emma's response was cautiously optimistic. "Bring them to my office first thing Monday morning. If they're as significant as you believe, we can begin building a case that even the Ashworth family's resources can't defend against. Isabella spent the weekend in a state of nervous energy, alternately elated by the discovery of her father's evidence and terrified by the magnitude of what she was about to undertake. Taking on the Ashworth family would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed, would expose her to dangers she could barely imagine. But as she sat in her flat Sunday evening, one hand resting on her still flat stomach, Isabella knew she had no choice. The child growing inside her deserved to know the truth about their grandfather, deserved to inherit justice rather than secrets. And Marcus Durant's daughter would finally have the chance to honor his memory by ensuring his killers faced the consequences of their crimes. Monday morning would mark the beginning of a war Isabella hadn't chosen, but was finally prepared to fight. Leonard Ashworth had awakened something powerful in her during their night together, had shown her what it felt like to be truly alive. Now she would use that strength to seek justice for the father whose death had haunted her entire life. The game Leonard thought he'd won by hiding the truth was about to become something far more dangerous than he could imagine. Isabella Durant was no longer the frightened, desperate woman who'd accepted his proposition out of necessity. She was Marcus Durant's daughter, armed with evidence and motivated by love, grief, and the growing certainty that some crimes were too monstrous to forgive. Leonard Ashworth was about to discover that the past he'd tried to bury was very much alive, and it was carrying his child. The first snow of winter fell on London like a blessing and a curse, transforming the city into something beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Isabella stood at the window of Emma Patterson's Lincoln's Inn chambers, watching flakes drift past the Georgian windows while her solicitor reviewed the final pieces of evidence that would destroy the Ashworth empire. 6 weeks had passed since Isabella's discovery of her father's hidden documents, 6 weeks of careful preparation and growing certainty that justice was finally within reach. The case Emma had built was devastating in its thoroughness, a web of financial records, correspondence, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic criminal activity spanning decades. "It's remarkable, truly remarkable," Emma said, looking up from the documents spread across her mahogany desk. "Your father was extraordinarily thorough in documenting the Ashworth family's crimes. These papers don't just prove murder, Isabella. They expose fraud, extortion, bribery, conspiracy. We're looking at RICO-level criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business practice." Isabella turned from the window, one hand unconsciously resting on her stomach, where a small bump was now visible beneath her carefully chosen clothing. At 3 months pregnant, she could no longer pretend the child didn't exist, couldn't ignore the life growing within her that connected her irrevocably to Leonard Ashworth. "How strong is the case?" Emma's smile was sharp as a blade. "Strong enough that I've been in contact with the Serious Fraud Office and the Crown Prosecution Service. They're very interested in pursuing criminal charges, particularly given the contemporary nature of your father's documentation. This isn't just historical prosecution, darling. The shell companies used to arrange your father's murder were also used for subsequent crimes, including a suspicious industrial fire in Birmingham 3 years ago that killed 2 security guards." Isabella felt something cold settle in her chest. The Ashworth family's crimes hadn't ended with her father's death. They'd continued, claiming additional victims while Leonard built his empire on a foundation of blood and corruption. "What about Leonard specifically? Can you prove he was involved?" Emma's expression grew more cautious. "That's where things become complicated. Leonard was 27 when your father died, certainly old enough to be involved in family business, but proving his direct participation in the murder conspiracy will be challenging. The documents implicate Richard Ashworth primarily, with Leonard mentioned only peripherally." Isabella nodded, understanding the legal complexities even as her heart cried out for complete justice. But he knew. He's known for weeks about his father's crimes and tried to cover them up. Knowledge after the fact isn't the same as conspiracy before it, unfortunately. However, Leonard's attempts to conceal evidence could constitute obstruction of justice, and if we can prove he profited from criminal activity, he could face charges for money laundering and racketeering. Emma leaned forward, her expression serious. Isabella, before we proceed, I need you to understand what you're about to face. The Ashworth family won't simply surrender. They have resources, connections, influence that reaches into every level of government and law enforcement. They'll come after you personally, will try to destroy your credibility, your character, your life. Isabella thought about the child growing inside her, about the responsibility she carried to ensure Leonard's son or daughter inherited a world where justice was possible. They've already destroyed my life once, Emma. I won't let them do it again. Emma studied Isabella's face, noting the steel that had replaced the frightened vulnerability of their first meeting. There's something else we need to discuss. Your pregnancy. Isabella's hand tightened protectively over her stomach. She told Emma about the child during their second meeting, needing legal advice about potential complications the pregnancy might create. The tabloids will have a field day once they discover you're carrying Leonard Ashworth's child. They'll paint you as a gold digger, claim the entire case is motivated by desire for money or revenge. Emma's voice was gentle but uncompromising. It will be extremely difficult to maintain focus on the legal merits when the press is obsessed with the personal drama. Isabella had considered this, had spent sleepless nights wondering whether the pregnancy made her cause stronger or weaker. The child exists, Emma. I can't change that, and I won't hide it. If anything, it proves I have nothing to gain from Leonard's destruction except justice. Emma nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right attitude. We'll control the narrative by being proactive, releasing information on our terms rather than allowing others to speculate. She gathered the documents into neat piles. I think it's time to approach Leonard directly, give him the opportunity to cooperate before we file formal charges. Isabella felt her pulse quicken. She hadn't seen Leonard since that morning at the cottage, hadn't spoken to him since their final professional interaction in his office. The thought of facing him now, armed with knowledge of his family's crimes and carrying his child, filled her with equal measures of anticipation and dread. What exactly are you proposing? A meeting, neutral ground, properly documented, where we present the evidence and offer him the chance to provide information about other victims, other crimes. If he cooperates fully, the prosecution might consider reduced charges. Emma's smile was sharp. Of course, cooperation would require him to admit publicly to his family's criminal activities, which would destroy the Ashworth reputation permanently. Isabella considered the proposal, weighing justice against revenge, legal victory against personal satisfaction. Arrange the meeting, Emma, but I want to be there when you confront him. Emma raised an eyebrow. Isabella, that's not advisable. These negotiations are delicate, and your presence would add emotional complications that could undermine our position. My presence is the point, Isabella said firmly. Leonard needs to face the daughter of the man his family murdered. He needs to look me in the eye and acknowledge what he's done. Emma studied Isabella's expression, recognizing the determination that had carried her through months of careful preparation. Very well. But we do this properly, with everything recorded and witnessed. I won't have him claiming later that he was coerced or misled. The meeting was arranged for the following week at Emma's chambers, neutral territory that emphasized the legal rather than personal nature of their confrontation. Leonard's response to the request had been immediate and professional, agreeing to the meeting without questions that suggested he understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Isabella spent the days before the confrontation in a state of nervous energy, alternately confident in the strength of their case and terrified of seeing Leonard again. The pregnancy had begun to show more clearly, a small but undeniable bump that would announce her condition to anyone who looked closely. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, a navy blue dress that was professional but flattering, that hinted at rather than concealed her pregnancy. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, instead of pulled back in its usual severe bun, and she wore the pearl earrings that had been her mother's. If she was going to face the man who'd unknowingly fathered her child, she would do it as herself, rather than hiding behind professional armor. The morning of the meeting dawned grey and cold, London wrapped in the kind of winter fog that seemed to muffle sound and blur the edges of reality. Isabella arrived at Lincoln's Inn early, needing time to compose herself before the confrontation that would determine the course of the rest of her life. Emma's chambers occupied the third floor of a Georgian building that had housed barristers for 3 centuries, its wood-paneled walls lined with law books that contained the accumulated wisdom of English jurisprudence. The conference room where they would meet Leonard was formal, but comfortable, with a polished table surrounded by leather chairs and windows that looked out over the inn's historic courtyards. "Remember," Emma said as they waited, "let me handle the legal discussion. Your role is to be present, to represent your father's memory, but don't let emotion override strategy." Isabella nodded, though she suspected that emotion would be unavoidable once Leonard walked through the door. She hadn't seen him in 2 months, hadn't spoken to him since, learning the truth about his family's crimes. The man she'd given herself to, the father of her unborn child, was complicit in her father's murder. The contradiction felt like carrying fire and ice in her chest simultaneously. At precisely 10 o'clock, Leonard arrived with his own legal representation, Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, one of London's most feared criminal defence barristers, a man whose reputation for destroying prosecution cases was legendary. Leonard himself looked exactly as Isabella remembered, tall and elegant in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than she earned in a month. But there were subtle changes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights, shadows under his grey eyes, a tightness around his mouth that suggested he understood exactly why he'd been summoned. His gaze found Isabella immediately, and she saw shock flicker across his features as he registered her presence. For a moment, his professional mask slipped completely, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath the surface. Then his eyes dropped to her midsection, taking in the small but unmistakable curve of early pregnancy, and Isabella watched his face go completely white. "Miss Durant," Leonard said quietly, his voice hoarse with surprise. "I wasn't expecting... I didn't know you would be here. Where else would I be, Mr. Ashworth?" Isabella kept her voice steady, despite the chaos raging in her chest. "This is about my father, after all." Emma took control before the personal tension could derail their carefully planned strategy. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I believe you understand why we've requested this meeting. Miss Durant has come into possession of certain documents that shed new light on the circumstances surrounding her father's death." Sir Geoffrey leaned forward with the predatory attention of someone who'd built his career on finding weaknesses in prosecution cases. "What sort of documents, if you don't mind my asking?" Emma slid a folder across the table, its contents arranged to maximum devastating effect. "Correspondence between your client's father and Marcus Durant, financial records showing payments to shell companies, and most significantly, a letter written by Mr. Durant 2 days before his death explicitly identifying Richard Ashworth as the person threatening his life." Isabella watched Leonard's face as he reviewed the documents, saw the moment when understanding and horror crashed over him like a wave. His hands shook slightly as he read his father's letters, the casual threats disguised as business correspondence, the systematic escalation that had culminated in murder. "Where did you get these?" Leonard's voice was barely above a whisper. "My father hid copies with my grandmother before he died," Isabella said, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. "He knew your family was going to kill him, Leonard. He documented everything because he wanted to make sure his daughter would someday know the truth." Leonard looked up from the documents, his grey eyes bright with what might have been tears. "Isabella, I swear to you I didn't know. Not until Margaret found those files in storage. I had no idea what my father had done. But you've known for weeks, haven't you?" Isabella's voice grew stronger, fueled by righteous anger. "You've known that your family murdered my father, and your first instinct was to cover it up, to protect yourself from the consequences of your father's crimes." Leonard flinched as if she'd struck him. "I was trying to protect you. I thought if you never learned the truth, you could live without that burden. Protect me." Isabella's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You mean protect yourself. Protect your reputation, your business, your comfortable life built on blood money." Sir Geoffrey intervened before the conversation could deteriorate further. "My client had no involvement in the events surrounding Mr. Durant's death. He was 27 years old at the time, focused on his legal studies rather than family business matters." Emma opened another folder, revealing documents that Isabella recognized as part of Leonard's university records. According to these academic transcripts, Mr. Ashworth took a leave of absence from Cambridge in October 2006, citing family obligations. That leave coincided exactly with the period of highest activity in Project Nightingale. Isabella watched Leonard's face crumble as the web of evidence tightened around him. Even if he hadn't directly participated in her father's murder, he'd been present during the conspiracy, had benefited from its success, had inherited an empire built on crime and corruption. The Crown Prosecution Service is prepared to pursue charges of conspiracy, money laundering and ongoing criminal enterprise, Emma continued, her voice professionally neutral. However, they might consider reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation, including testimony against other family members and associates who participated in these activities. Leonard looked across the table at Isabella, his expression a mixture of desperation and something that might have been love. "What do you want from me?" Isabella met his gaze steadily, seeing the man who'd held her in the darkness of a Cotswold cottage, who'd made her feel alive for the first time in her adult life. But she also saw the son of her father's killer, the inheritor of blood money, who'd tried to hide the truth even after learning it. "I want justice for my father. I want acknowledgement of what your family did, and I want to make sure that no other families are destroyed by Ashworth crimes." Leonard nodded slowly, understanding that his comfortable world was about to end regardless of his choices. "And if I cooperate? If I provide everything I know about my father's activities?" Emma leaned forward. "Then perhaps we can discuss arrangements that don't involve lengthy prison sentences. Community service, restitution to victims' families, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The goal is justice, Mr. Ashworth, not destruction for its own sake." Leonard was quiet for several long minutes, staring down at the documents that detailed his family's crimes with methodical precision. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed, hardened into something Isabella recognized as resolve. "I'll cooperate fully. I'll provide everything I know, testify against anyone who was involved, do whatever is necessary to ensure justice is served." Leonard's eyes found Isabella's across the table. "But first, I need to speak with Miss Durant privately. There are things that need to be said between us." Emma started to object, but Isabella held up a hand to stop her. 5 minutes, but everything stays on the record." Emma nodded reluctantly, activating the recording equipment that would document whatever passed between them. Sir Geoffrey looked as though he wanted to advise his client against private communication, but Leonard's expression brooked no argument. "Isabella," Leonard said once they were alone, "I know you hate me. I know you have every right to hate me, but I need you to know that what happened between us had nothing to do with your father. Nothing to do with business or manipulation or any of the ugly things my family has done." Isabella felt tears threatening despite her determination to remain composed. "How can you say that? Everything between us was built on lies, Leonard. You knew who I was, knew what your family had done to mine." "I didn't know," Leonard said desperately. "I swear on my life, Isabella, I had no idea about your father until Margaret showed me those documents. Yes, I pursued you inappropriately. Yes, I used your financial desperation to coerce you into something you didn't want. Those were unforgivable actions, and I'll regret them for the rest of my life. But what I felt for you, what I still feel, had nothing to do with your name or your history." Isabella studied his face, looking for deception and finding only raw honesty that made her chest tight with conflicted emotion. "It doesn't matter what you felt, Leonard. It doesn't change what your family did." "No, it doesn't," Leonard agreed quietly. "But it matters for this." He gestured toward her midsection, where the evidence of their connection was becoming impossible to hide. Isabella's hands moved protectively to her stomach, shielding the child from whatever storm was about to break. "You're carrying my child," Leonard continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Our child Isabella, innocent of every crime committed by previous generations. What happens to that child? What kind of world do we create for them?" Isabella felt something crack inside her chest, all the careful walls she'd built to contain her feelings about the pregnancy, suddenly crumbling. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how to raise a child whose grandfather murdered their grandfather. I don't know how to explain that kind of legacy." Leonard rose from his chair and moved around the table, stopping just close enough that Isabella could smell his familiar cologne. could see the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. Let me help you figure it out. Let me be part of their life, even if you never forgive me for what my family did to yours. How can I trust you? How can I trust anything you say, after learning you've known the truth for weeks and chose to hide it? Leonard knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level with the desperate supplication of someone who understood he was about to lose everything that mattered. Because I love you, Isabella. I fell in love with you the moment you walked into my office, and learning the truth about your father only made me love you more. You're stronger than I ever imagined, braver than I'll ever be. Our child will be lucky to have you as their mother. Isabella looked down at this powerful man on his knees before her, begging for forgiveness he might not deserve, and felt her resolve waver. The pregnancy hormones that coursed through her system made emotions unpredictable, turned rational thoughts into swirling confusion of love and hate and desperate hope. I can't think about this now, Isabella said finally. I can't think about us or the baby or any kind of future until justice is served for my father. Everything else has to wait. Leonard nodded, understanding that he'd been given a reprieve rather than forgiveness. Then let's get justice for Marcus Durant. Let's make sure the truth comes out and the people responsible face consequences. After that, we'll figure out the rest. Emma returned at that moment, professionally tactful in pretending she hadn't been listening from the corridor. Have you reached any understanding? Mr. Ashworth has agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution, Isabella said, her voice steady despite the emotional upheaval of the past few minutes. He'll provide testimony, documentation, whatever is needed to ensure justice is served. Emma smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd achieved a significant victory. Excellent. I'll contact the CPS immediately to arrange formal proceedings. Sir Geoffrey, I assume you'll want to negotiate the specific terms of your client's cooperation. Sir Geoffrey nodded grimly, understanding that his role had shifted from defending Leonard's innocence to minimizing the consequences of his cooperation. We'll need immunity agreements, protection for Mr. Ashworth's testimony, assurance that his cooperation will be reflected in any sentencing recommendations. As the lawyers discussed technicalities, Isabella found herself studying Leonard's profile, memorizing the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair had grown slightly longer since she'd last seen him. In a few months, she would give birth to a child who would carry his features, would grow up knowing that their father's family had destroyed their mother's family. But perhaps that child could also represent redemption, could be the bridge between past sins and future possibilities. If Leonard truly cooperated with the prosecution, if he dedicated himself to making amends for his family's crimes, perhaps their child could inherit something other than a legacy of violence and corruption. The meeting concluded with agreements to reconvene once formal immunity deals had been negotiated. Leonard would spend the next several weeks providing detailed testimony about every aspect of his family's criminal activities, would help prosecutors build cases against associates and accomplices who'd escaped justice for decades. As they prepared to leave, Leonard approached Isabella one final time, his expression vulnerable in ways she'd never seen during their professional relationship. I know you need time, he said quietly. I know trust will have to be earned rather than given. But Isabella, please don't shut me out completely. Let me prove that I'm not my father, that I can be the kind of man worthy of you and our child. Isabella studied his face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with desperate hope. Prove it through your actions, Leonard. Show me that justice matters more to you than self-preservation. Help me get answers for all the families your father destroyed, not just mine. Leonard nodded solemnly. I will. I promise you, Isabella, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what my family did. Isabella gathered her coat and handbag, preparing to return to a world that would soon know the truth about the Ashworth Empire's criminal foundation. The media attention would be overwhelming, the scrutiny intense, but she felt ready for whatever storm was coming. As she reached the door, Isabella turned back one final time to look at Leonard, seeing him not as the powerful lawyer who'd coerced her into his bed, but as the father of her unborn child, a man facing the destruction of everything he'd built in service of truth and justice. Leonard, she said softly, for what it's worth, I believe you when you say you didn't know about my father. And I believe you when you say you love me. But love isn't enough to overcome this kind of legacy. You'll have to prove that you're willing to sacrifice everything for justice, just like my father did. Leonard met her gaze steadily. I am, whatever it costs, Isabella, whatever it takes. Isabella nodded and walked out into the London afternoon, feeling the first stirrings of something that might eventually become forgiveness. The child growing inside her would be born into a world where truth had triumphed over power, where justice had been served despite decades of concealment. But first, the Ashworth Empire would have to fall, and Leonard would have to prove that love could motivate redemption as powerfully as it had once motivated destruction. The final act of their complicated dance was about to begin, and Isabella intended to see it through to whatever end awaited them all. Behind her, Leonard remained in the conference room, staring out at the grey London sky and preparing to dismantle everything his family had built in service of a woman who might never forgive him, and a child who deserved better than the legacy of blood and corruption that had defined the Ashworth name for generations. The game that had begun with calculated seduction was about to end with something far more dangerous than either of them had imagined. The possibility of love surviving truth and redemption emerging from the ashes of justice served at last. Spring arrived in London with unusual gentleness, as if the city were holding its breath for the conclusion of the trial that had captivated the nation for 3 months. Isabella Durant stood at the window of the witness waiting room at the Old Bailey, watching cherry blossoms drift past the ancient courthouse like snow made of hope, her hand resting on the pronounced curve of her 7-month pregnancy. The trial of Regina Ver's Ashworth associates had become the most closely watched criminal proceeding in recent memory, exposing decades of corporate corruption that reached into the highest levels of British society. Leonard's cooperation had proven even more devastating than Emma Patterson had predicted, unraveling a web of criminal activity that implicated dozens of prominent figures in politics, finance, and law enforcement. But today marked the culmination of everything Isabella had worked toward since discovering her father's hidden documents. Today, Leonard would give his final testimony, the capstone to months of detailed revelations about his family's crimes. And today, the jury would finally hear the complete truth about Marcus Durant's murder. "How are you feeling, darling?" Emma asked, settling into the chair beside Isabella with the careful movements of someone who'd been working 18-hour days for months. The trial had taken its toll on both of them, but Emma's satisfaction was evident in every line of her body. They were winning decisively and completely. Nervous, Isabella admitted, shifting uncomfortably as the baby stirred restlessly in her womb, ready for this to be over. The media attention had been overwhelming, just as Emma had predicted. Isabella's pregnancy had made her a figure of fascination for the tabloids, who couldn't resist the dramatic irony of the murdered man's daughter carrying his killer's grandchild. Photographers followed her to medical appointments. Reporters shouted questions outside her flat, and opinion pieces debated whether her relationship with Leonard constituted forgiveness or exploitation. Through it all, Leonard had maintained careful distance, respecting Isabella's need for space, while quietly ensuring her security and comfort. His legal team had arranged for bodyguards, though they were discreet enough that Isabella sometimes forgot they were there. Her rent was mysteriously paid for months in advance. Her grandmother's care facility received anonymous donations that ensured the finest treatment available. Leonard never took credit for these gestures, never used them to pressure Isabella for contact, but she recognized his hand in the careful protection that surrounded her. "The prosecution is calling Leonard back to the stand," Emma said, reviewing her notes one final time. "This is his opportunity to address the jury directly about his father's role in your father's murder. Are you prepared for that?" Isabella nodded, though her heart rate quickened at the thought of seeing Leonard again. Their last encounter had been 2 weeks ago, when he'd testified about the shell companies used to arrange her father's death. Isabella had watched from the gallery as Leonard methodically destroyed his own family's reputation, providing evidence that would ensure his father's associates spent their remaining years in prison. The transformation in Leonard over the past months had been remarkable to witness. The arrogant, controlling man who'd coerced her into his bed had been replaced by someone humble, focused entirely on making amends for his family's crimes. He'd liquidated most of his assets to establish a fund for victims of corporate crime, had closed down the profitable but ethically questionable divisions of his law firm, had dedicated himself to cooperation with authorities investigating related cases across Europe. But Isabella remained uncertain whether his transformation was genuine remorse or elaborate performance designed to win her forgiveness. Trust, once shattered, proved difficult to rebuild, especially when the stakes included not just her own heart but the welfare of their unborn child. "Miss Durant?" A court officer appeared in the doorway, his expression respectfully professional. "They're ready for you in the gallery." Isabella rose carefully, Emma's steadying hand at her elbow as they made their way through corridors that had witnessed centuries of British justice. The Old Bailey's Central Criminal Court was packed to capacity, every seat filled with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who'd followed the case with fascination. Isabella's usual seat